The auction gavel came down with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking, and Claire Donovan raised her trembling hand before she could talk herself out of it. $7. 7 crumpled, sweat-dampened dollars from the bottom of her purse. And somewhere in the back row a man actually laughed out loud, a short, sharp bark of disbelief that made 3 people turn around to see who the crazy woman was. Claire didn't turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the auctioneer, on his bored face and his sliding spectacles, and she waited for him to tell her it was a mistake, that he'd misheard, that nobody in their right mind would accept $7 for a standing structure, even one that had been condemned twice and flooded 3 times and sat at the dead end of a county road nobody drove down anymore. But the auctioneer just shrugged, made a note on his clipboard, and moved on to the next lot. Sold. For $7. To the thin blonde woman in the faded gray coat who had driven 200 miles to a county she'd never been to, carrying everything she owned in a hatchback with 2 bald tires and a little girl asleep in the back seat. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her name was Claire, and she was 34 years old, and 48 hours ago, she'd been standing in the driveway of a house that wasn't hers anymore, watching a sheriff's deputy change the locks while her 7-year-old daughter Lily asked whether they were going on a vacation. Claire had said yes, a kind of vacation, and Lily had believed her, because Lily was still young enough to believe that her mother had answers. The truth was that Claire had nothing. Not an apartment, not a job, not a savings account with more than $31 in it, and not a husband, because Daniel had died 14 months earlier in a way that had left her not just widowed but ruined, stripped of everything they'd built together by a man she had loved and a life she had trusted. The abandoned diner sat at a crossroads where 2 county highways intersected in the flat bottomlands of central Missouri, about 90 minutes from any real city, in a place called Hadley's Bend that used to have a post office and a feed store and now had neither. The building was long and low, with a flat tar roof that had been patched so many times it looked like a topographical map, and a front wall of plate glass that was mostly still intact, though 2 of the windows had been boarded over with plywood so old the paint had weathered off. A rusted sign on a pole out front still said in faded red letters, "The Roadside," and beneath that in smaller letters, "Open 24 hours." Neither of those things had been true for about 18 years. The diner had closed in 2007 when the highway bypass rerouted all the truck traffic to the interstate 6 miles north, and after that it had passed through the hands of 3 different owners who had each tried to reopen it, and each failed. And then it had sat empty for a decade, while the county slapped liens on it for unpaid taxes, and the bank that held the mortgage went under, and the whole property ended up in foreclosure limbo. The kind of place that ended up at a county auction with a starting bid of $1 because nobody in their right mind wanted it. Claire had not come to the auction intending to buy a diner. She had come because a woman at the gas station where she'd spent the previous night sleeping in her car had told her there were foreclosure auctions every Tuesday at the county courthouse, and sometimes the cheap lots went for nothing, and sometimes they came with utility hookups already, and if you were desperate and had nowhere to sleep, a roof was a roof. Claire had taken the woman's kindness and the cup of bad coffee she'd offered, and she had driven to the courthouse and sat in the back of the room and watched 2 houses sell for $18,000 and $24,000, and a vacant lot sell for $300, and she had almost gotten up to leave when they called Lot 47, the commercial property at the corner of County Road B and Route 19, minimum bid $1, condition as is. Taxes owed $4,600 and paid by County Forgiveness Program. Something had made her stay. Something had made her raise her hand when no one else did, and keep raising it until the price climbed from $1 to $4 to $7. Bid against by a farmer who was probably just messing with her and who gave up with a smirk when she went to $7. She had $7 and she had bought a diner. The man at the clerk's window had looked at her driver's license and her cash and her expression, which she was trying very hard to keep composed, and he had said, "You know that place has been empty a long time, right?" And Claire had said yes. And he had said, "You know it floods, right?" And Claire had said she'd heard that. And he had handed her a brass key on a wire loop and a manila folder with the deed inside. And he had said, "Good luck, ma'am," in a tone that wasn't sarcastic but also wasn't hopeful. And Claire had walked out of the courthouse into the February cold with the key in her fist and the deed under her arm. And she had sat in her car for 20 minutes crying silently so Lily wouldn't wake up. And then she had started the engine and driven out to Hadley's Bend too. Look at what she'd bought. The first sight of it almost broke her. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds growing through it in clumps, and one rusted shopping cart lying on its side, and a raccoon that ran away when she pulled in. The front door was chained shut with a padlock that didn't match the key she'd been given, and she had to walk around the building 3 times before she found a side entrance with a lock that the brass key actually opened. The door groaned when she pushed it inward, and a wave of cold, stale air came out, smelling of mildew and rodent and old grease, and something else, something faintly sweet and rotten that she couldn't identify. She stood in the doorway with Lily's small hand in hers, and she looked into the dark interior, and she thought, I have made a terrible mistake. But she went in anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. The interior of the diner was exactly what you would expect from a building that had sat empty for a decade and been unheated and unsecured for most of that time. The long Formica counter ran the length of the back wall, with 8 chrome stools still bolted in place, their red vinyl cushions split open and spilling yellow foam. A row of booths lined the front windows, their tables warped and their bench seats water-stained. The floor was checkered black and white linoleum, curling up at the edges, and there was a layer of grit and dried mud over everything, as if floodwaters had come and gone many times. Above the counter, a hand-lettered chalkboard still advertised specials from 2007. Meatloaf plate, $7.95. Chicken fried steak, $8.25. Coffee, $1.50. Claire stared at those prices, and something inside her caught, because the handwriting on that chalkboard was not careful or professional. It was quick and slanted and had a little flourish on the capital M in meatloaf, and she knew that handwriting. She knew it the way you know your own breath. That was Daniel's handwriting. Her husband had written on that chalkboard. Claire's knees went out, and she sat down hard on the nearest booth bench, and she put her hand over her mouth, and she made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and Lily looked up at her with those big brown eyes and said, Mama, what's wrong? Are you scared? And Claire shook her head, because she couldn't answer. Because how do you explain to a 7-year-old that the man who used to be her father, the man who died when she was 6 and whose face she could barely remember anymore, had once stood in this exact room and written chicken fried steak $8.25 on a chalkboard in his own hand, 18 years before Claire had ever met him? She had not known. That was the thing. Daniel had told her once, very briefly, very long ago, that he had grown up in Missouri and that his mother had owned a diner and that his mother was dead now, and so was the diner. He had said it the way people say things they don't want to talk about, and Claire had respected that and never asked more. She had assumed the diner was a small chapter in a childhood he didn't like remembering. She had not known it was here. She had not known the name of the town. She had not known that when she'd chosen, almost at random, to stop at a gas station in a county she'd never heard of, she had been 90 minutes from the place her husband had grown up. But now that she was inside, pieces started to assemble. The way the auctioneer had said the former owner's name, Ruth Donovan, and Claire had almost raised her hand to correct him, because Donovan was her married name, but she hadn't, and now she understood why Ruth had felt familiar. Daniel's mother had been named Ruth. He had mentioned her exactly twice in their whole marriage. Claire had the sense that there had been a falling out, something bitter, something that Daniel had closed off and refused to revisit, and she had let him have that privacy because everyone deserved a few locked rooms inside themselves. Now, standing in her dead husband's childhood home, Claire understood that some locked rooms should not stay locked. She stood up slowly and took Lily by the hand and walked through the building. The kitchen was behind the counter, through a swinging door that had come partially off its hinge. The range was an old 8-burner gas unit, caked with years of grease that had hardened into something black and geological. The walk-in freezer had been emptied, but the door still worked, and the light still came on when she pulled the cord. A small office sat off the kitchen, with a beat-up metal desk and a filing cabinet and a calendar on the wall from June of 2007. Past the office, a narrow hallway led to a storeroom piled with broken chairs and stacks of paper menus and a crate of coffee mugs, most of them cracked. And at the end of the hallway, a door that said private in hand-painted letters, and behind that door, a set of steep wooden stairs going up to a second floor she hadn't known the building had. Claire hesitated at the bottom of those stairs. The air coming down them was dry and cold and smelled different from the rest of the building. Less of mildew, more of old wood and dust. Lily wanted to go up, and Claire said no, not yet. And she closed the door and they walked back out to the car, and she sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the steering wheel for a long time, trying to decide what she was feeling. It was not fear exactly. It was something more disorienting than fear. It was the feeling of having stumbled into a story that had been going on without her, a story whose first chapters she'd missed, a story that involved her husband and her daughter and a grandmother Lily had never met, and a diner at the dead end of a county road. She drove to the nearest town, a place called Ellsworth that was 10 miles back toward the interstate, and she found a dollar store and spent 4 of her remaining dollars on a package of cleaning cloths and a spray bottle of all-purpose cleaner and a flashlight with batteries included. And she bought a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter and 2 bananas with what was left. She had $3 and some change to her name, and she had a 7-year-old to feed, and she had a building that might kill them both if the roof caved in while they slept. But she drove back to the diner because she had decided something in the parking lot of that dollar store. She had decided she was going to stay. She had decided that whatever Daniel had left behind in this place, whatever the story was that she'd walked into the middle of, she was going to find it out. Because the alternative was getting back in her car and driving away, and she had driven as far as she could drive, and she had nowhere left to drive to. That first night, she and Lily made a little camp in the largest booth, the one farthest from the broken windows, and Claire spread out a blanket from the car, and they ate peanut butter sandwiches in the dark with the flashlight propped on the table between them. Lily thought it was an adventure. Lily asked if they were camping like on a trip, and Claire said yes, and Lily said it was the best camping ever, and Claire had to turn her face away so her daughter wouldn't see her cry. It was very cold inside the diner because the heat had been off for a decade and the windows weren't sealed, but Claire bundled Lily in 2 sweatshirts and a wool blanket and put her next to the wall where the draft was least, and Lily fell asleep with her thumb in her mouth, something she hadn't done since she was 3. Claire lay next to her on the bench seat, staring up at the water-stained drop ceiling, and she listened to the building. It creaked. It settled. A mouse or a rat moved in the ceiling above the kitchen. Somewhere a piece of loose metal clanged softly in the wind. Outside, a truck went by on the distant interstate, a faint rising hum that peaked and then faded. Claire thought about her husband as a boy in this building, carrying plates, washing dishes. She thought about his mother Ruth, who had owned it, and who had died estranged from her only son and never met her only granddaughter. She thought about the door at the top of the stairs, the door marked private, and she knew that sooner or later she was going to open that door. But not tonight. Tonight she was going to sleep in a booth next to her daughter in a dead diner at a crossroads in a county she didn't know, and she was going to try to be grateful that she had a roof, even one that was probably full of holes. She woke sometime before dawn to the sound of someone knocking on the front door. Claire sat up so fast that Lily whimpered in her sleep and rolled over. The knocking was not loud. It was 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and then silence, and then 3 more, and then silence. Claire's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She eased out of the booth without waking Lily, and she crept across the checkered floor in her socks, keeping low, and she peered around the edge of the boarded-up window toward the front door. There was no car in the parking lot. She could see her own hatchback, and beyond it the empty asphalt, and then the road, and nobody. But someone had knocked. She waited. The knocking came a 3rd time, and now she saw him. A tall, thin figure standing on the front step, partly visible through the narrow strip of plate glass that wasn't boarded. An old man. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat and a wool cap, and he was holding something in his hands, a paper bag, maybe, or a box. He knocked a 3rd time, waited a moment, and then he set whatever he was holding down on the front step and turned and walked away, down the steps and across the parking lot. And Claire watched him cross the road and disappear into the tree line on the other side. He had not come by car. He had walked. Claire waited until the pre-dawn dark had begun to gray into actual morning, and then she unlocked the side door and walked around to the front, and she found on the step a brown paper grocery bag, neatly folded at the top. Inside were 2 foam containers. One held scrambled eggs, sausage patties, and home fries, still warm. The other held 2 biscuits and a small tub of gravy. There was also a thermos of coffee and 2 styrofoam cups and a handwritten note on a torn piece of paper. The note said, in shaky block letters, "Welcome back. Ruth would be glad." Claire stood in the parking lot in the cold gray dawn, and she held the bag of warm food, and she read the note 3 times, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry or be afraid. Someone in this town knew who she was. Someone had seen her arrive. Someone had gotten up before dawn to cook breakfast and walk it to her front door and leave it anonymously. And that someone had known Ruth and had wanted her to know. She took the food inside and she woke Lily gently, and they ate a hot breakfast at a booth in their dead diner. And Lily asked who brought it, and Claire said a friend, and Lily said, "We have friends here," and Claire said, "Yes, we have friends here," and she meant it even though she didn't yet know who. That first week in Hadley's Bend taught her that the town wasn't dead, just quiet. There were maybe 200 people living within a 3-mile radius of the crossroads, most of them farmers or retirees, and within about 48 hours of her arrival, all of them seemed to know that Ruth Donovan's long-lost daughter-in-law had shown up with a little girl and bought the diner for $7. Claire figured this out because people started appearing. A woman in her 60s named Dolores showed up with a casserole and said she had worked for Ruth as a waitress for 12 years and would Claire be opening the place back up. A farmer named Leland drove up in a pickup and said he had 3 gallons of kerosene in the bed, and did Claire need a space heater? He had an extra one in his shed. A kid of about 16 rode up on a bicycle and said his grandma had sent him over with a jug of well water in case the pipes weren't running yet, and they weren't. Claire accepted everything. She was not in a position to refuse kindness. She learned the kid's name was Caleb and his grandmother was Marge, and Marge lived down the road a half-mile. She learned that Dolores still worked part-time at a nursing home in Ellsworth, but was looking for more hours. She learned that Leland knew how to fix almost anything mechanical and had known Daniel when Daniel was a boy and had, in fact, taught Daniel how to drive a tractor when Daniel was 12 years old. When Leland said this, casually, while he was showing her how to light the kerosene heater, Claire had to step outside for a minute and press her palms against her face. Daniel had been 12 years old here. Daniel had driven a tractor on this land, and she had never known. By the end of the first week, she had electricity, running water, a working refrigerator, a mattress with clean sheets, and a box of Magic Treehouse books for Lily from a kindly librarian in Ellsworth. Every piece of it had come from somebody who had once been fed or helped or just listened to by Ruth Donovan, and who had shown up now, 20 years later, to quietly repay a debt they still felt they owed. Claire had never experienced anything like it in her life. But with every act of kindness came a question Claire was not ready to answer. Everyone wanted to know what had happened to Daniel. They remembered him as a boy. They had assumed he was still alive somewhere, and the fact that his widow had shown up alone with a child and a broken-down car told them something bad had happened, and they were too polite to ask directly, but they kept circling the subject, waiting for her to offer information. Claire parried these gentle inquiries for most of the first week. She said Daniel had passed. She said it had been hard. She said she didn't like to talk about it. People nodded and accepted this, but she could see them exchanging looks, and she knew that sooner or later she was going to have to tell someone the whole story, because the whole story was part of what had brought her here, whether she'd known it or not. The whole story was this. Daniel had been a civil engineer, steady, well-paid, kind. They'd met at a friend's wedding when they were 26 and married 2 years later, and had Lily when Claire was 28. For 6 years, everything had been exactly what Claire had wanted. Then, 14 months ago, on a clear Tuesday afternoon, Daniel had driven to work and not come home. 2 days later, his car had been found in the parking lot of a regional airport 90 miles away, his wedding ring in the cup holder, a one-way ticket to Belize booked under a different surname. In the weeks that followed, the forensic accountants had pulled their life apart. Daniel had been embezzling almost $400,000 from his firm over 3 years, moved through shell companies and offshore. The firm had been preparing to confront him. He had gotten wind. He had run. Except Daniel had not made it to Belize. He had made it only as far as a cheap motel 6 miles from the airport, where the manager had found him 2 days later in a room checked in under the second name. The cause of death had been ruled a heart attack. He had been 39 years old with no history of heart trouble. The medical examiner had been unable to determine conclusively whether the heart attack had been natural or induced, and Claire had been too shattered to push, and the whole thing had closed as natural causes. What Claire had been left with, after all of it, was an empty house the bank took because she couldn't pay the mortgage, a life insurance policy that refused to pay out, a savings account attached in civil settlement, a hatchback in her name alone, and a 7-year-old who had asked where Daddy was every day for 6 months and then, horribly, stopped. She had also been left with shame. with the quiet, certain knowledge that the man she had loved for 8 years had been planning for 3 of those years to walk out on her. And with a question she had not been able to answer and was afraid to ask, which was, who had Daniel been, really, underneath the man she had lived with? She had not come to Missouri looking for that answer. She had come to Missouri because she had driven until her money ran out. But now, standing in her husband's childhood diner, reading the prices he had chalked onto a board when he was a teenager, she began to understand that maybe there was an answer here after all. Maybe there was a beginning to the story in this building. Maybe if she could find where the man she had married had started, she could understand how he had become the man who left. The second week, she opened the door marked private and went up the stairs. The upstairs was a small apartment. 2 rooms and a tiny bathroom and a kitchenette. It had clearly been where Ruth had lived. The larger room had been a bedroom and still had a bed in it, stripped to the mattress, and a dresser with empty drawers and a closet with a few wire hangers and nothing else. The smaller room had been a living room and had a single armchair, a lamp with no bulb, and a bookshelf containing about 40 books, mostly paperback mysteries, and some cookbooks, and a Bible and 2 photo albums. The apartment smelled dry and abandoned, as if the air itself had been sitting there for 10 years, but it was in better shape than the downstairs. The roof, at least, had not leaked up here. The walls were plaster and dry. The floorboards did not sag. Claire stood in the middle of the living room and turned slowly in place and tried to imagine her mother-in-law sitting in that armchair reading one of those paperback mysteries in the evening after the diner had closed. Tried to imagine Daniel, at 16 or 17, coming up these stairs and saying goodnight. Tried to imagine what had gone wrong in this small apartment between a mother and a son, what had caused the rift that had made Daniel leave home at 18 and never come back, and never bring his wife to meet his mother, and never bring his daughter to meet her grandmother. She pulled one of the photo albums off the shelf and she sat down in the armchair, and a small cloud of dust puffed up around her, and she opened it. The first page showed a very young Ruth, maybe 20 years old, standing in front of the diner when its sign was new and its paint was fresh. She was pretty in a wiry, hard-working way, dark hair pinned up, a white apron, a shy smile. The next page showed her older, holding a baby. The baby was Daniel. Claire knew it was Daniel because he had the same cowlick at age 1 that he had still had at age 39. She touched the photograph, and she felt something crack in her chest that she did not have a name for. There were pictures of Daniel at every age, of a tall, quiet man who must have been his father, of the 3 of them together in the early years, and then just the 2 of them as Daniel grew older. The last photograph in the first album was of Ruth alone, older, maybe in her 50s, standing behind the counter with her hands on her hips. She looked like a woman who had been running a diner for too long by herself. The second album was different. It contained newspaper clippings and letters. Ruth being honored for 20 years of service. Ruth hosting a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department. Ruth named Citizen of the Year. And near the back, a clipping that made Claire stop breathing. It was an obituary from 2006 for a man named Harold Donovan, aged 62, former mechanic and Vietnam veteran, survived by his wife Ruth and his son Daniel. Services at the Hadley's Bend Methodist Church. In lieu of flowers, donations to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 4412. Harold, Daniel's father, who had died in 2006, who had been alive and living in this town all the years Daniel had been away. Claire stared at the obituary and she understood that Daniel had been 28 years old in 2006, engaged to her, and he had never told her his father had died. He had not come home for the funeral. He had let her believe, by his silence, that his father had been dead for a long time already. She closed the album and sat holding it in her lap. What happened in this family, she thought? What was so bad that a son did not come home to bury his own father? She looked up slowly and her eyes traveled across the small living room and caught on something she had not noticed before. Behind the bookshelf, partially hidden where the shelf did not quite meet the wall, there was a panel in the plaster that was a slightly different color from the rest. A square of newer plaster, maybe. Or maybe a patch. Claire stood up. She walked to the shelf. She crouched down and she ran her fingers along the edge of the off-color patch. And she felt where the seam was, and she pressed on it. And the panel flexed slightly inward, as if it were not plaster at all but a thin piece of painted wood covering a hole. She worked her fingernails around the edge. The panel came loose with a soft, dry sound. Behind it was a recess in the wall about 8 inches square and maybe a foot deep, and inside the recess, on its side, was a small metal box. Olive green. Military surplus, maybe. The kind you might keep ammunition in, or important papers, or whatever you had that you didn't want anyone to find. Claire lifted it out. It was heavy, heavier than she expected. She set it on the floor in front of her, and she looked at it for a long time before she opened it, because she had the feeling, very strong, very clear, that whatever was in this box was the reason she had ended up in this town. That whatever was in this box was the thing her husband had been connected to, whether she had known it or not, and whatever was in this box was going to change everything. She took a breath, and she lifted the lid. Inside, on top, was a letter in a sealed envelope. The envelope was addressed in a slanted handwriting she knew as well as her own. It said, in Daniel's hand, for Claire. If you are reading this, I am sorry. Claire sat on the dusty floor of her dead mother-in-law's apartment and held the envelope in her hands and did not open it. She could not open it. Not yet. Her hands were shaking too hard and her breath was coming in short, sharp pulls that were close to sobbing. And she knew that whatever was inside that envelope was going to reshape a version of her husband she had already reshaped twice since he'd died. Once from the man she thought he was to the man who had tried to run away from her, and again from that man to a person she'd stopped being able to picture at all. She did not think she could survive another reshaping without being ready for it, and she was not ready. She put the envelope back into the box, and she closed the lid, and she carried the box downstairs, and she set it on the counter of the empty diner. And she walked outside into the cold afternoon, and she stood in the parking lot, and she breathed until her hands stopped shaking. Lily was over at Marge's house playing with a kitten that Marge's granddaughter had brought by. Claire had maybe an hour of privacy, but she did not use that hour to open the envelope. She used that hour to sit in the front booth and look at the closed box and think. Daniel had been here. Daniel had put something in a hiding place in the wall of his mother's apartment. Daniel, who had not spoken to his mother in years. Daniel, who had not come home for his father's funeral. Daniel, somehow, at some point, had been in this building, in that apartment, and had used a hiding place that he knew about, probably from his childhood, to leave something for her. Which meant that Daniel had come back. Secretly, probably. Recently, maybe. And he had done it knowing, or at least believing, that one day Claire might end up in this building. But that was impossible. The only way she had ended up here was a chain of coincidences beginning with her homelessness and a stranger in a gas station. Daniel could not have planned that, could he? Unless he had planned something else. Unless he had planned, at some point when things started going wrong at the firm, that if he had to run, he wanted to leave behind a way for her to find him. And this had been that way. Claire sat with the box, and she did not cry because the crying she had done over Daniel was not crying that was available to her anymore. What was available to her now was a cold, clear anger that she was trying to hold at arm's length, because if she let it get close to her, she would not be able to function, and she had a 7-year-old to feed. The anger was simple. The anger was, you had a mother. You had a father. You had a whole life and a whole town full of people who loved you, and you hid all of it from me. For 8 years I slept next to you, and you never told me that there was a place in Missouri where people still remembered you as a boy. You never told me that your father was alive for the first 4 years of our marriage and died without you going to see him. You never gave me the chance to know you. She thought, who did I marry? She thought, who was I a wife to? She thought, what else did he hide? And then, because there were practical things that needed doing before it got dark, she stood up and she put the metal box in the kitchen under the counter where Lily would not find it. And she went outside to split a pile of kindling that Leland had left for her. Because the small life she was trying to build here did not pause for her to have a crisis. The kerosene heater was not going to run forever. The nights were getting colder. And somewhere between now and morning she had to decide whether she was going to open that envelope tonight or tomorrow, or whether she was going to be the kind of woman who could leave it closed forever. She did not split the kindling well. Her hands were still shaking. She caught her thumb twice with the hatchet and made a small cut that bled enough to worry her. And she went inside to wash it. And as she was running her thumb under the cold tap water, she looked out the kitchen window over the sink, and she saw, across the road, at the edge of the tree line, the old man. The one who had left the breakfast on her doorstep the first morning. He was standing there, very still, watching the diner. When he realized she had seen him, he did not turn and run. He simply lifted his hand in a small, slow wave, and he held it there for a moment, and then he turned and walked back into the trees. Claire stood at the kitchen sink with her cut thumb bleeding onto the enamel, and she thought, I need to know who that man is. That evening, after Lily came home from Marge's house full of stories about the kitten, after Claire had made them both grilled cheese sandwiches on the burner, she'd finally gotten working. After Lily had fallen asleep on the air mattress Claire had pumped up in the little office behind the counter, Claire sat down at the booth with the metal box in front of her, and she turned on the single overhead light, and she opened the lid. She took out the envelope. She slid her thumbnail under the flap. She began to read. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on lined paper torn from a pad, and the first line was, Claire, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong, and I am sorry, and I owe you an explanation I should have given you a long time ago. The letter said that Daniel had started taking money from the firm 3.5 years earlier, and that he had not started taking it because he wanted to leave her. He had started taking it because a man who worked with his father in Vietnam had shown up at his office one day and told him that his father had left a debt, and the debt had been called in, and the debt was the kind of debt that did not stop with the death of the person who had incurred it, but passed to the family. Daniel had not believed him at first. Daniel had asked for proof. The man had provided proof. Daniel had understood that the proof was real, and that the debt was real, and that the debt was large enough that Daniel could not pay it on an engineer's salary, and that the people the debt was owed to were not people who would accept a payment plan. He had started taking the money, Daniel wrote, because he had been afraid that if he did not, these men would come for Ruth first, and after Ruth they would come for Claire and Lily. He had been paying them in installments for 3 years. He had hated himself every single day. He had told no one, because to tell anyone was to expose them to the same danger. He had tried, repeatedly, to find a way out. He had considered going to the FBI. He had been warned, specifically and directly, that going to the FBI would guarantee that Ruth and Claire and Lily would not survive the week. So he had kept paying, and he had tried to find the end of it, and there had been no end of it. Then, Daniel wrote, his mother had died. Not of old age, not of illness, of what had been called, in the coroner's report, a fall down the stairs of her apartment. Daniel did not believe she had fallen. Daniel believed she had been pushed, or worse, as a warning, as a message that the next person on the list was Claire. He had not gone to the funeral, he wrote, because he had been afraid that going would confirm to these men that he still cared about his family and give them more leverage. He had stayed away in the hope that they would assume his mother had meant nothing to him, and that therefore his wife and daughter were not effective hostages either. The plan to disappear, he wrote, had not been a plan to leave Claire. It had been a plan to become untraceable, so that when he did what he was about to do next, no one would think to come for her. He had been planning to turn over everything he knew to the FBI through an intermediary and then vanish into witness protection for long enough for the arrests to happen, and then he had intended to come back for Claire and Lily under a new identity. He had known she would hate him for a while. He had known he would have to explain. He had thought the explanation would be easier to survive than the alternative, which was to keep paying these men forever and watch his family die one by one. If she was reading this letter, Daniel wrote, then the plan had failed. Probably he was dead. Probably they had gotten to him at the motel before he had made the call to the intermediary. He did not think they knew he had come home to hide this letter and the other things in this box. He did not think they knew about Hadley's Bend at all, because he had been very careful, over the years, to remove his connection to this town from every record he could find. The firm had known him only as a man from Missouri, state of origin unspecified. His driver's license had carried a P.O. box in a different city. He had done this not to cut his family off, but to protect them, because he had understood, once the debt had come for him, that anyone who knew his real origin could be used to hurt him. He wrote that there was money, not in the box. The box contained proof of what he was telling her, and some papers she might need. But there was money hidden elsewhere in the building, and she would have to find it, because he did not trust paper hiding places to stay hidden. He had written his instructions in a form that he hoped only Claire would understand. The instructions were, the number I counted the day I proposed. Start there. Then where the two of you liked to sit when the rain came. Then the song I could never remember the words to. Then the color of her first balloon. That is the sequence. That is the order. Trust it. Trust me. The letter ended. I am sorry I did not tell you any of this. I am sorry for every cold night you are having because I could not find another way. I am sorry I did not trust you enough to let you decide, With me, how we would face this. You deserve to be my wife, not my secret. I loved you every day of our marriage, including the days I was stealing from a firm to pay a ransom on my father's ghost. I do not ask you to forgive me. I ask you to take care of our daughter and of yourself, and if you can, of my mother's building, because she loved it, and because the people in Hadley's Bend are the only people left on earth who knew me as a boy, and they are good people, and they will help you if you let them. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Daniel. Claire finished the letter, and she folded it carefully, and she put it back in the envelope, and she sat at the booth in the dim light of the overhead bulb, and she cried without making any sound, for a long time, because Lily was sleeping in the next room, and because she did not know what else to do. She cried for Daniel, and she cried for Ruth, who had been pushed down a staircase, and she cried for Harold, who had apparently done something in Vietnam that had caught up with his son 30 years later, and she cried for her own stupid belief for 14 months that her husband had simply been a cheater and a thief, when the truth was worse and better at the same time. Worse because her husband had been in a kind of trap she had not imagined. Better because he had not wanted to leave her. He had been trying, in a broken and stupid and secretive way, to save her. She did not know yet whether the money was real. She did not know yet whether there were still men out there who thought a debt was owed. She did not know yet whether she should be afraid. What she knew, sitting at that booth in the middle of the night in a dead diner in a town her husband had been born in and never told her about, was that she was not the widow of a criminal. She was the widow of a man who had been fighting a war alone and had lost. And he had sent her here. One way or another, everything he had done in his last year of life had been designed, at least in part, to point her toward this building, if the worst happened. Because he had known that in this town, in this place where people still remembered his mother, there were people who would catch her when she fell. And so Claire had fallen, all the way down to $7 in a dead end, and she had landed exactly where he had wanted her to land. She sat with that for a while. Then she took the letter and she put it back in the box, and she locked the box inside the metal filing cabinet in the little office, and she went to check on Lily, who was asleep with her thumb in her mouth and her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Claire leaned down and she kissed her daughter's forehead, and she whispered, "Your daddy loved you. Your daddy loved you more than I knew. I am so sorry I have been angry at him. I am going to fix this, baby. I am going to fix all of it." She went back to the main room, and she stood behind the counter where her mother-in-law had stood for 30 years, and she looked out through the plate glass at the cold, dark crossroads, and she thought about the first clue in Daniel's sequence, the number I counted the day I proposed. She remembered the day Daniel had proposed. It had been a Saturday in October, a cold day, and he had taken her hiking up a trail that overlooked a small lake north of the city, and at the top of the trail there had been a bench, and he had sat her down on the bench, and he had pulled a ring out of his pocket, and he had told her, ridiculously, that he had counted the steps from the parking lot to the bench, and it had been exactly 417 steps, and he had counted them because he had wanted to remember every part of the walk, because he knew that at the end of the walk his life was going to change. 417. That was the number. She stood behind the counter, and she looked around the diner, and she tried to imagine what Daniel might have meant by start there. 417. 417. Was it a combination? A distance? A page number in a book? Then she thought about the checkered floor, the black and white squares of linoleum that ran the length of the building. She had walked across them 100 times in the last 2 weeks, and she had never counted them. But what if one of them was not like the others? What if, in a building where everything else was identical grid, somewhere there was a tile you could lift? She found a broom, and she started at the front door, and she counted the tiles one by one, walking slowly, tapping each one lightly with the handle of the broom as she went. 1, 2, 3. The tiles were 12 inches square, and most of them sounded solid against the broom handle. Some sounded hollow, but these were the ones where the subfloor had rotted a little, and she could tell the difference after a while because the hollow rotted tiles gave a dull, soft sound, not a sharp one. She was listening for a sharp, hollow sound, the kind you would get if someone had taken up a tile, built a small cavity underneath it, and set the tile back. She counted past 300. She counted past 400. At 417 she stopped, and she looked down, and the tile at her feet was next to the base of one of the booths, half hidden under the edge of the bench seat. She knelt down, and she tapped it with the broom handle, and it sounded exactly like the others. Solid, not hollow. For a moment her heart sank. Then she remembered. The number I counted. Daniel had counted from the parking lot. He had started his count outside. Start there. She had started her count at the front door. She went back to the front door, opened it, and stood on the top step. She tapped the step. She counted it. 1. Then she stepped down onto the concrete walkway in front of the diner. 2. She began to count again, her footsteps light on the cracked concrete, and she walked not toward the parking lot, but back toward the front door, and she counted every tile and every step and every transition. And at 417, exactly, she was standing behind the counter next to the register. She looked down. The floor behind the counter was not checkerboard linoleum. It was a different kind of flooring, narrow planks of dark brown vinyl made to look like wood. She knelt down and she ran her fingers along the seams of the planks, and one of them, just one, was not glued down at the end. It came up when she tugged at it. And underneath it, set flush into the subfloor, was a small metal hinge. She lifted another plank, and another. And after she had lifted 6 planks, she was looking at a trap door about the size of a briefcase, with a small iron ring set flush into it. She pulled the ring. The trap door lifted. Beneath it was a hollow space in the subfloor, not much bigger than a shoebox, and inside the space was a small fireproof safe. Gray metal. Combination lock with 3 dials. Claire stared at it for a long moment. Then, very quietly, in the dim light of the overhead bulb in her dead mother-in-law's dead diner in a town she had not known existed 3 weeks ago, she began to laugh. Not because anything was funny. Because the clues were real. Because Daniel had actually done this. Because there had been a plan, all along, and she was following it, and it was going to lead her somewhere. She did not open the safe tonight. She would need the rest of the sequence, and she was too tired to do it tonight, and she had a feeling that she was going to need to be ready for whatever was inside. She laid the planks back over the trap door. She put the broom away. She sat down at the booth and she wrote out Daniel's instructions on a paper napkin in her own careful handwriting, because she did not want to keep taking the letter out of the box. The number I counted the day I proposed. Where the two of you liked to sit when the rain came. The song I could never remember the words to. The color of her first balloon. For clues. She had solved 1. She had 3 to go. And somewhere in this building, behind or beneath or inside something she had been walking past for 3 weeks, there was a safe that her husband had put money into. Money that might be the difference between Lily growing up poor or Lily growing up whole. She also understood, now, that she had to be careful. Because if the men Daniel had been paying existed, and if the letter was correct that they might not know about Hadley's Bend, then every person who now knew she was in Hadley's Bend was a person who might, inadvertently, tell someone who should not be told. Dolores, Leland, Marge, Caleb, the librarian with the magic treehouse books, the plumber with the free pipes. None of them would betray her on purpose. But someone in this town, somewhere, might say something to someone somewhere, and someone somewhere might be listening. And then, there was the old man at the tree line, who had left breakfast on her step, who had written welcome back. Ruth would be glad, who knew who she was, who watched the diner from the woods. Claire did not know if he was a friend. She did not know if he was a warning. She sat down on the air mattress next to Lily, and she did not sleep for a long time. And when she did sleep, she dreamed of her husband walking up the hiking trail on the day he'd proposed, counting his steps out loud, 415, 416, 417, and then turning to her and smiling, his face the face she had loved for 8 years and lost 14 months ago. And he said, "I didn't leave you. I just ran out of time." And Claire woke up with tears on her face and the first gray light of dawn at the windows, and she understood that her real work here was only beginning. The second clue was waiting. The men who had killed her mother-in-law might be waiting too. The old man in the trees was waiting. The town was waiting. The diner was waiting. Claire got up and put on her coat and walked to the front door and stepped outside into the cold, and she stood on the top step and looked out across the empty crossroads at the dawn coming up over the flat fields, and she said, out loud, to no one, "Okay, Daniel. Okay, I'll finish it for you. I'll find the rest. I promise." And somewhere across the road, in the tree line, very briefly, a flashlight beam flickered on and off. Once, as if an answer, the flashlight beam had come from the exact spot where the old man had stood before. Claire watched the tree line for 10 more minutes, her breath clouding in the cold dawn air, and nothing else moved. No second flash. No figure stepping out of the woods. Just the gray trunks of the bare trees and the low rolling fog coming off the fields and the sense, very strong, that whoever had signaled her had wanted to be seen only once, and only by her, and was now watching from somewhere she could not see him. She went back inside and she locked the side door, and she sat at the booth with her hands wrapped around a mug of the instant coffee Dolores had brought over 2 days ago. Lily was still asleep. The kerosene heater was hissing quietly in the corner. Claire had about 45 minutes before Lily would wake up and ask for breakfast, and she used those minutes to think very carefully about what she was actually going to do next. She had solved one clue. The second clue was, where the two of you like to sit when the rain came. She turned that phrase over in her head. Where the two of you like to sit. That language, the two of you, did not mean Claire and Daniel. Daniel had not said, where we like to sit. He had said, the two of you. He was talking to her about 2 other people. He meant himself and someone else. Himself and Ruth, maybe. Or himself and his father. Or himself and a friend. Some pair that had, in this building, had a place they liked to sit when it rained. And he had not given her the names because he had been careful, in the letter, not to give the men who might someday read the letter too much information. He had written the clues in a way that required her to already know things about him. Private things. Things that only a wife would know. Or things that a wife could find out if she started asking the right questions of the right people. And Claire realized, sitting at the booth, that this was the real architecture of what Daniel had done. He had not just hidden money in the building. He had hidden himself in the building. The clues were not really about locations. The clues were about his childhood, which she had never been allowed to see, and the only way to solve them was to learn, from the people in this town, the boy he had been. He had forced her, by the structure of the puzzle, to finally get to know him, even if she had to do it posthumously. For a moment, this made her angry again. The familiar, useless anger. That even in death, he was still making her do the work. Still making her uncover him piece by piece, instead of simply telling her. Then the anger passed, because she understood why he'd done it that way. He'd done it that way because he couldn't put the whole story in a letter that might be found. He'd done it that way so that by the time she reached the money, she would know enough about him, enough about this place, enough about his parents, to understand what the money was for and what it meant. She would not just inherit cash. She would inherit him. Lily woke at 8. Claire made her oatmeal on the single working burner, with a spoonful of the strawberry jam Marge had sent over, and while Lily ate and hummed a song from a Magic Treehouse audiobook, Claire sat across from her and said, very casually, "Hey, sweetheart, I think today we should go visit some of the people in town. I'd like to meet them properly. Would that be okay?" Lily was thrilled. Lily had been meeting new people every day for 2 weeks and had reached the age where the word stranger was thrilling rather than scary. They bundled up in their coats. Claire folded a thermos of coffee into a canvas bag with a tin of the shortbread cookies Dolores had pressed on her, and they walked out into the morning and got into the hatchback and drove the half-mile down County Road B to Marge's house, because Marge had been the first person to say, casually, one afternoon, that she'd known Daniel since he was a baby. Marge's house was a small white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and 3 orange tabby cats lying on the steps in a patch of morning sun. Marge herself came to the door in a housecoat and slippers, and when she saw Claire and Lily standing there with a tin of cookies, she laughed out loud and said, "Honey, that's my tin. I gave those to Dolores last week. We are trading them around like a chain letter." She pulled them inside and sat them down at a kitchen table covered in a red and white checkered vinyl cloth, and she poured hot cocoa for Lily and strong black coffee for Claire, and she said, "All right. You have that look. You want to ask me something? Ask." Claire took a breath. "Marge, can you tell me about Daniel when he was a boy?" Marge's face softened. "Oh, honey," she said. "Of course I can. Of course I can." And Marge told her, over the next 2 hours, while Lily ate a second bowl of cocoa with mini marshmallows and played on the back porch with the orange cats, the story of Daniel Donovan as a child. Daniel had been a quiet, serious boy who had read every book in the Hadleys' bin one-room library twice by the time he was 12. Daniel had loved his mother fiercely and had fought with his father about the tiniest things. Harold had been a hard man, Marge said carefully, not a bad man, but a hard one. The kind of man who had come back from Vietnam with pieces of himself missing and had never quite figured out how to love anyone gently again. Daniel had spent his childhood in 2 modes. Working the diner with his mother, which he loved, and avoiding his father, who scared him. He had been a scrawny kid. He had been bullied at school for being the diner kid, for smelling like French fries, for being quiet. And he had found refuge in one place, and only one place besides his mother's kitchen. He had found it at the house of his best friend, a boy named Thomas Grady, who had lived in the small white house with the blue shutters on the north edge of town. Thomas had been Daniel's friend from kindergarten until the day Daniel left for college, and Thomas's grandfather, an old man named Bernard Grady, had been almost a second father to Daniel, especially after Harold started drinking more and coming home less. Bernard Grady had been a World War II veteran and an amateur carpenter and a quiet, patient man who had taught Daniel everything Harold should have taught him: how to use a saw, how to fish, how to cast a lure across a pond without tangling the line, how to sit still and listen. Claire's hand tightened around her coffee mug. "Marge, is Bernard Grady still alive?" Marge nodded slowly. "He is, honey. He's 87 years old. He lives in that same little house. His grandson Thomas moved away years ago, went to engineering school same as Daniel. Ended up in California, I think. Bernard stays on the land because that's where his wife is buried. Out back, in the family plot. He doesn't come to town much anymore. People bring him what he needs. He still chops his own wood." Claire said, very quietly, "Does Bernard know I'm here?" Marge looked at her for a long time. "Honey," she said, "Bernard knew you were here before any of us did. Bernard is the one who told me to watch for you. 2 weeks before that auction, Bernard called me up and said, 'Marjorie, Ruth's girl is going to come to that diner. Her name is Claire. She's going to have a little girl with her. You help her any way you can.' I asked him how he knew. He said, 'Never you mind how I know. You just help her.'" Claire set the coffee mug down on the checkered tablecloth with great care, because her hand was shaking and she did not want to spill it. She said, "Marge, has Bernard been bringing me breakfast?" Marge's face broke into a slow, sad smile. "He has, honey. Every morning since you got here. I watched him from my kitchen window the first morning. He walks the quarter-mile through the back field and through the tree line, and he leaves it on your step, and he walks back. I figured he'd tell you when he was ready." "Ready for what?" Marge hesitated. Then she said, carefully, "You need to ask him that yourself." Claire drove home with Lily singing in the back seat, and her own heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Bernard Grady, the best friend's grandfather, the second father, the man who had taught Daniel how to fish, the old man at the tree line, and something he was ready or not ready to tell her. Something, Claire thought, that might have to do with a rainy afternoon in a diner and where two boys used to sit. She did not drive to Bernard's house that morning. She drove back to the diner. Because if she was right about the second clue, she could solve it herself, and she wanted to solve it before she went to see him. She wanted to walk into his house, already knowing. She wanted to understand what he was going to tell her before he told her, so that when she said, "I found the safe," it would not sound like an accusation, but like a conversation between two people who already understood each other. Back at the diner, she settled Lily in the office with a coloring book, and she stood in the main room, and she looked at it with new eyes. She was looking for the place two boys would sit when the rain came. Not a grown-up's place. Not behind the counter. Not in the kitchen. A kid's place. A corner. A hideaway. Somewhere you could pretend you were not part of the working diner, even though you were surrounded by it. Somewhere a small person could tuck himself into and watch the adults and feel invisible. Her eyes moved over the booths. 8 of them lined the front windows. The first 7 were identical. The 8th, the one at the far end of the building, against the wall that backed up to the kitchen, was tucked into a slight alcove formed by the way the kitchen wall jutted out. That booth was shadowed from the front windows. That booth was the smallest. That booth, she thought, was where a shy kid would sit with his best friend and eat French fries on a rainy afternoon while his mother worked the counter and the rain ran down the plate glass. She went to the 8th booth. She slid into the bench seat that faced the wall. The seat creaked under her. She looked up. Above the booth, screwed into the wall, was a small decorative shelf, the kind of shelf that in a diner from the 1970s would have held ceramic salt shakers shaped like chickens or a vase of plastic flowers. This shelf held neither. It held a single old framed photograph. Claire had walked past it 100 times. She had never looked at it closely. She stood up and she lifted the frame off the shelf and she turned it over in her hands. The photograph was of 2 boys, maybe 9 or 10 years old, sitting in this very booth, grinning at the camera. One of them was unmistakably Daniel. The other was a thin, dark-haired boy with a gap between his front teeth. Between them on the table was a plate of French fries and 2 root beer floats. And out the window behind them, you could see rain sheeting down against the glass, turning the parking lot into a blur. Written on the bottom of the photograph in faded blue ink were the words, Danny and Tommy. Rainy day? Summer 1989. Claire turned the frame over. The back of the frame was a thin piece of cardboard held in by small metal tabs. She bent the tabs back. The cardboard lifted out. Taped to the inside of the cardboard was a small slip of folded paper. She unfolded it with hands that had started shaking again. On the paper, in Daniel's handwriting, was a single number, 22. She stood there holding that slip of paper, and she understood that Daniel had not hidden the combination in these places because he was trying to make her do a scavenger hunt. He had hidden it in these places because anyone searching the building casually would never find it. The combination to the safe was in 4 pieces, for small numbers, each hidden in an object that only someone who knew Daniel could find. She went to the trap door behind the counter. She lifted the planks. She crouched down next to the safe. There was no point trying the combination without all 4 numbers, but she wanted to look at it. 3 dials. The first dial she needed was 417. No, that was the clue. The clue had led her to the booth, which had contained the real first number. She went back to the booth. She looked at the slip of paper. 22. That was the second number. So she needed the first number, too. The first hiding place, the number counted the day he proposed, must have contained its own slip. She had been so focused on counting to the trap door that she had forgotten the clue was not about the count itself. The count had led her to the safe, which meant the first number was hidden somewhere else, somewhere associated with that proposal. She sat down slowly on the booth bench, and she tried to think like her husband. Then she understood. Daniel had not meant the trail. Daniel had meant the bench. The bench where he had proposed to her had been a park bench at the top of the hiking trail, 20 minutes outside the city where they had lived. That bench was hundreds of miles from here. She could not go back to that bench. But if the clue was about the bench, then maybe there was a bench in this diner. A bench that was not one of the booth benches. A bench that was set apart. Her eye traveled around the room, and she found it immediately because it was the only one. Against the back wall near the door to the kitchen stood a single wooden church pew, about 6 feet long, dark-stained, scuffed with decades of use. It had probably been used as waiting room seating for customers who wanted takeout, back when the diner was open. Claire had walked past it every day and never looked at it. She went over to it now, and she knelt down, and she began to feel along its underside. The wood was smooth with age, and it had no obvious compartments. She ran her fingers along every inch of the bottom of the seat, and along the back, and along the support rails. Nothing. She was about to give up when her hand brushed the end of one of the pew legs, and she felt something strange. A small round depression, like a hole, drilled into the bottom of the leg. She tipped the pew up carefully. The leg was hollow at the bottom. Someone had drilled up into it. She fished into the hole with her little finger, and she felt paper rolled tightly. She pulled it out. A slip of paper, tightly curled, tied with a piece of string. She unrolled it. On it, in Daniel's handwriting, was a single number. 8. 3 down. 1 to go. The song I could never remember the words to. The color of her first balloon. She had the first 3 numbers. 8, 22, and whatever the song was going to give her, and then the color would be the 4th. She sat down on the pew with the 3 slips of paper in her lap. 8, 22. Unknown. Unknown. The song I could never remember the words to. Daniel had hummed songs constantly. He had been a bad singer with a terrible memory for lyrics. He had made up his own words to songs all the time, which had driven Claire crazy at first, and then become one of the things she loved about him. But there had been one song in particular, one song that had been their song, that Daniel had never been able to remember the words to no matter how many times he heard it. It had been the song that had played at their wedding for their first dance. An old standard. At Last, by Etta James. At last. My love has come along. Claire hummed it under her breath, and she felt her throat close up because she could hear Daniel's voice trying to sing along with her at their wedding, getting the melody right and the words completely wrong, singing something about long roads and coming home, which had nothing to do with the actual lyrics. He had never been able to remember them. It had become a joke between them. Whenever that song came on, anywhere, Daniel would sing his own improvised version, and Claire would laugh and correct him, and he would nod and agree, and 3 days later, he would have forgotten again. So the clue was about that song. About Etta James. About At Last. She got up and she walked around the diner looking for something musical. Something that would contain a reference to that song. A record player. A jukebox. A radio. And then she saw it, sitting on a shelf behind the counter, half hidden by an old coffee maker. An old tabletop radio, the kind with a brown plastic case and a silver dial. Ruth had probably kept it on during the breakfast rush. Claire took it down from the shelf. She turned it over. On the bottom, taped to the back with yellowed Scotch tape, was a small folded piece of paper. She did not need to unfold it to know what it was. She unfolded it anyway. In Daniel's handwriting, 31. 8. 22. 31. The fourth clue was the color of her first balloon. The color of whose first balloon? It had to be Lily's. Lily's first birthday party. Lily had been 1 year old, and Claire had bought a bunch of helium balloons for the party, and Lily had ignored all of them except for one, which she had latched onto and refused to release for the entire afternoon, and had cried when her father had finally taken it from her at bedtime. That balloon had been yellow. Pale yellow. Like butter. And Daniel, weeks later, had bought a pale yellow balloon from a grocery store florist because Lily had kept asking for one, and had brought it home to her, and Lily had been delighted, and it had become a small ritual for a while. Daniel bringing home a yellow balloon once a month, on the 13th, Lily's birthday day. Daniel had done that for almost 2 years before it had tapered off. So the color was yellow. And the clue about the color was somewhere in the diner, in something yellow. Claire stood and she looked around, and she understood that the only yellow thing in the entire building was the foam insulation leaking out of the torn vinyl cushions of the 8 chrome stools at the counter. Every one of those stools had yellow foam inside it. Every single one. Which meant the clue was in one of them, and she would have to open each of them up. She did not want to tear apart all 8 stools if she could help it. She looked at them more carefully. 7 of them had cushions that were torn in the middle, the foam bulging out in a haphazard way. One, the third stool from the left, had a cushion that was torn along one specific edge, as if it had been cut with a knife rather than split by wear, and restitched with thick, dark thread that did not match the red vinyl. Claire sat down on that stool. She felt along the stitching. She pulled gently at the thread. It came loose. She reached inside the cushion, past the foam, and her fingers touched a small plastic bag. She pulled it out. Inside the bag was the last slip of paper. In Daniel's handwriting, 14. 8. 22. 31. 14. For numbers. The safe only had 3 dials. So the combination was 3 numbers, and the fourth was something else. Maybe a date. Maybe an address. Maybe a further instruction for something inside the safe. She decided she would figure it out when she got to it. She lifted the planks behind the counter. She knelt in front of the safe. She dialed 8, 22, 31. She took a breath. She pulled the handle. The safe opened. Inside the safe was a thick padded envelope, and beneath the envelope, wrapped in cloth, a smaller metal lockbox. Claire took out the envelope first. It was heavy. She opened the flap. Inside were bundled bills, rubber-banded, mostly hundreds. She did not count them. She did not want to count them yet. She could see that there was a lot. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She set the envelope aside and she took out the smaller lockbox. It had a keyhole instead of a combination. She looked at the 4th number on the slip of paper. 14. She had no key. 14 was not a key. 14 was something else. A locker number. A safe deposit box number. A page. A date. She thought about it. 14. The 14th of something. And then she understood. Daniel's father Harold was buried in the Hadley's Bend Methodist Cemetery. Harold's obituary had said so. And in small-town cemeteries, graves were often numbered by row and plot. 14 might be a plot number. Harold's plot. She pushed that thought aside for now. The key could wait. She set the locked box back in the safe, covered it with the planks, went to Lily, and told her they were going to drive into Ellsworth to go to the bank, and Lily said okay. And they bundled back into the car, and Claire put the padded envelope into the diaper bag she still carried because she had not owned a real purse in over a year, and she drove to Ellsworth with her hands shaking on the wheel and her heart loud in her ears. At the bank, in a private office with a young woman named Rebecca who did not ask questions, Claire opened a savings account and a safe deposit box. She deposited $300 in the savings account, keeping the rest of the envelope in the safe deposit box. She counted the money there, carefully, privately, with the office door closed. There were $82,000 in the envelope. 82,000. Claire sat in that small office with her hands folded in her lap and the stack of money on the table in front of her, and she cried, silently, for the second time that week. $82,000 was not a fortune. It was not the kind of money that made somebody rich. But it was the kind of money that meant Lily would not go hungry. It was the kind of money that meant Claire could fix the roof of the diner. It was the kind of money that meant she could decide what to do with her own life, instead of being decided upon by circumstance. It was enough to breathe. It was enough to stand up straight. Rebecca offered her a tissue. Claire took it. Rebecca said, in a very gentle voice, "Ma'am, are you all right?" Claire said yes, she was all right. She was more all right than she had been in over a year, and she was sorry. It was just a lot. Rebecca nodded as if she had seen women cry over small amounts of money before, and understood that sometimes the smallness of the amount made the crying worse, because of how much that small amount meant. And Rebecca quietly completed the paperwork and handed Claire the safe deposit box key on a small brass ring and said, "This is yours now. You come visit it whenever you like." Claire drove back to Hadley's Bend with Lily eating a cinnamon roll Claire had bought her at the bakery next to the bank, and she did not go straight to the diner. She drove instead to the Methodist church on the edge of town, and she parked in the small gravel lot, and she walked through the cemetery gate with Lily holding her hand. The cemetery was small and neat, with 50 or 60 headstones arranged in rows. The rows were numbered with small wooden markers stuck into the ground at the end of each row. Claire walked down the rows until she found the marker that said 14. She walked down row 14, reading the names. Harold Donovan's grave was the third one in. A simple gray granite stone. Harold Donovan, 1944 to 2006. Beloved husband and father. Rest in peace. Beside it, to the right, was another stone. This one said, Ruth Donovan, 1947 to 2023. She loved. She fed. She stayed. Claire stood there for a long moment with Lily's small warm hand in hers, and she said, out loud, so Lily could hear, "This is your grandma, baby. And this is your grandpa. I'm sorry you never got to meet them. They would have loved you very much." Lily said, "Are they under the ground?" Claire said, "They are. But the part of them that was love, that part goes into other people who are still here. And some of that part of them is in you. It's in the way you laugh. It's in the way you're kind to animals. It's in the way you hold my hand." Lily thought about that for a minute. Then she squatted down and she put her small hand on the grass in front of Ruth's stone, and she said, "Hi, Grandma. I'm Lily. I live in your diner now." Claire had to turn away. When she had composed herself, she looked back at the two stones, and she noticed something she had not noticed before. On Ruth's stone, in the bottom right corner, someone had carved a very small symbol. A tiny bird. It was not part of the standard engraving. It looked hand-done, added later, maybe by somebody with a small chisel. It was not on Harold's stone, only on Ruth's. Claire crouched down and she looked at it closely, and under the tiny bird she saw another set of small characters, almost impossible to read unless you were looking for them. The characters were numbers and letters. BNK 4-7-7-2. She stared at them. BNK 4772. And she understood. A bank box number, or a bank account number, or a reference number for something at a bank. Ruth's stone had a reference engraved into it, probably after her death, probably by Bernard Grady. Because Bernard Grady had known what Ruth was protecting. Bernard Grady had known what Daniel had been hiding. Bernard Grady was the one who had been watching the diner and waiting for Claire. Bernard Grady was holding the rest of the story. She stood up. She took Lily by the hand. She walked out of the cemetery. She drove to Bernard Grady's house. Marge had pointed it out when they had driven past on the way back from Ellsworth the week before. The small white house with the blue shutters on the north edge of town. A one-story farmhouse with a sagging front porch and smoke coming out of the chimney and a neat pile of split firewood stacked along the side wall. Claire parked in the driveway, and she sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel. Then she said to Lily, "Sweetheart, we're going to meet an old friend of Daddy's. His name is Mr. Grady. He knew Daddy when Daddy was a little boy like you. I need you to be very polite." "Okay." Lily nodded solemnly. They walked up the porch steps. The boards creaked under Claire's weight. Before she could knock, the door opened. Bernard Grady stood there in his heavy canvas coat and his wool cap, the same ones he had been wearing the morning he left the breakfast on her step. Up close he was tall and thin and slightly stooped, with white hair cut short and clean blue eyes and a weathered face that had spent 87 years outdoors. He looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Then he looked at Lily. Then he looked back at Claire, and his eyes filled up, and he said, in a quiet, rough voice, "You took your time, girl. But you got here. Come in. I've got soup on." The inside of Bernard's house was small and warm and clean. Wood-paneled walls, a braided rag rug on the floor, a wood stove glowing in the corner, a worn brown armchair with a crocheted afghan folded over the back. A framed wedding photograph on the mantel showed a young Bernard and a young woman who must have been his wife, both of them grinning in black and white. Below the mantel was a row of smaller photographs, and Claire saw in the second one from the left a picture of two boys, maybe 8 years old, holding up a fish between them on a dock somewhere. One of them was Daniel. The other, she guessed, was Thomas. Bernard seated them at his small kitchen table, and he ladled out bowls of beef and barley soup, and he cut thick slices of bread from a loaf he had apparently baked that morning, and he let them eat in silence for a few minutes before he spoke. Lily, absorbed in the soup, was not paying attention to the adults, which made it easier. "Your husband," Bernard said finally, "came to see me 2 months before he disappeared." Claire set down her spoon. "He came in the middle of the night. He drove all the way from where you lived. He got here at about 2 in the morning, and he knocked on my door, and I opened it, and he stood there on the porch, and he said, 'Bern, I need your help. I haven't got anyone else.' And I took him in, and I made him coffee, and I sat him down in that chair there, and he told me everything. 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 About the debt. About the men. About what his father had done in Vietnam. About his mother. About you and the little one. He told me he'd been paying them for 3 years, and he couldn't pay them anymore. He told me he'd been stealing from his job, and it was catching up to him. He told me he was going to try to turn them in, and that if he failed and they killed him, he needed somebody to make sure his wife got the rest of what he'd managed to save. He needed somebody to watch for her. He needed somebody who knew the diner and knew the town and knew how to find her when she came." "Why you?" Bernard smiled sadly. "Because he trusted me, honey. Because he'd known me longer than he'd known anybody else living. Because when he was 8 years old and his daddy came home drunk and hit him, Danny would run across the back field and through the trees and knock on my door, and I would sit him in that chair and feed him peanut butter toast and never say anything about it. He trusted me because I had never failed him. He said, 'Bern, I know I haven't been home in 20 years. I know I don't deserve a favor, but I don't have anybody else.' And I said, 'Boy, you have always had me. You did not need to come in the middle of the night to ask.'" "What did he tell you about the men?" Bernard was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Lily, who was mopping up soup with a heel of bread. He looked back at Claire. He said, "The men who were squeezing your husband are not men in any ordinary sense. They are the leftover end of something that started during the war. Your husband's father was part of a unit that ran supplies in country and then ran other things too. Currency mostly. The unit had a private arrangement with a group of South Vietnamese officers who were moving assets out of the country before the fall. Harold was the low man on that chain. He handled delivery. Near the end of the war, a shipment that Harold was responsible for disappeared. It wasn't taken by the Viet Cong. It wasn't lost. It was stolen. By Harold, or by someone Harold was working with. That shipment was worth a great deal of money. It was gold, mostly, and some stones. Harold never said what really happened to it. He came home to Hadley's Bend. He married Ruth. He worked at the garage. He raised Danny. And for 30 years nobody came looking. And he thought maybe the men had given up. But they hadn't given up. They had only been waiting. Who are they? They are an organization. Old men now, their sons and grandsons taking over. They have no name you would recognize. They have people who work for them in this country. They came to Harold 15 years ago, when Danny was in college, and they told him the debt was due. And if he could not produce the shipment or its equivalent, then his son would inherit the debt. Harold could not produce anything. He had spent it all, or lost it all, or I don't know. He begged them for time. They gave him time because they are patient. And then Harold died, and they waited a few years, and then they came to Danny. Why didn't you tell me this when I first got here? Bernard looked at her with his clear blue eyes. Because I promised your husband I would not tell you anything until you found what he had left you. He said, Bern, She will find the money because she is smarter than I am and she is more stubborn than I am. When she finds the money, she will come find you. And then you can tell her. But not before. Because if she knows there are men, she will be afraid, and she will make mistakes. Let her find her way to me on her own. And then we will work together on what comes next. Claire let out a long, shaky breath. What comes next, Bernard? Bernard set down his spoon. What comes next is that those men are going to find you eventually. Maybe not this month. Maybe not this year. But they are patient. They will notice eventually that Danny's wife is not where she used to be. They will find you here. And when they do, they will want what Danny could not pay them. What we do between now and then is we get you ready. We get you safe. We get the little one safe. And we figure out how to end this without you spending the rest of your life paying on your dead father-in-law's ghost. Claire said, in a voice that sounded small in the warm, small kitchen, can it be ended? Bernard Grady looked at her across the table. Then he looked at Lily, who had finished her soup and was examining a jar of honey on the shelf with great seriousness. Then he looked back at Claire. He said, Girl, in my experience, any debt a man makes can be unmade if you find the right door. Your husband was trying to find that door by going to the FBI. That was one door. It might have been the wrong one. There are others. I've been thinking on it ever since he came to me. I have some ideas. But first, I need to know what was in that safe. Not the money. The other thing. Was there another thing? Claire nodded slowly. A locked box. Bernard's face tightened. Did you open it? No. I don't have the key. I think the key is at Harold's grave, or near it. Row 14 is Harold's row. Bernard closed his eyes and for a long moment he didn't speak. When he opened them again, there was something in his face that had not been there before. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to grief mixed with something sharper. A hard old knowledge. Honey, he said, I think I know what's in that box. I think Danny got his hands on it somehow before the end. I think that's what he was trying to hand over to the FBI. I think he found a way to retrieve what his daddy had stolen 50 years ago. Claire said, the shipment? Bernard said, part of it, maybe. Or proof of where it went. Or proof of who the men were. Something. Something big enough that he thought he could trade his life for his family's. And he got it back here somehow, and he put it in that safe, and he wrote you a puzzle, because he was afraid that if he wrote you a map, they would find the map before you did. And then he went back to the city to set the deal up, and he did not come home. They were quiet for a long time. Then Bernard stood up slowly, his knees cracking, and he said, All right. Tomorrow morning, early, we go to the graveyard, and we find that key. And then we open that box. And then we know what we're dealing with. And then we decide, together, what to do. But tonight you are going to take the little one home, and you are going to lock the doors, and you are going to sleep. I have been watching that diner every night since you got here. I will watch it tonight. Nobody is going to come at you tonight. You have my word. Claire stood up. She did not quite know how to thank a man for this. In the end, she walked around the table and she hugged him. And he stiffened for a second in surprise, and then he folded his long arms around her and held her the way a grandfather holds a granddaughter. And she cried quietly into the canvas of his coat, and he patted her back. And Lily, who had looked up from the honey jar, watched them with large, serious eyes, and then came over and wrapped her arms around Bernard's leg. And Bernard put his other hand down on top of her head and said, in a voice that shook slightly, Oh, I have been waiting to meet you, little one. They drove back to the diner in the early dusk. Claire locked the doors. She made Lily macaroni and cheese on the single burner. She put Lily to bed on the air mattress, and she read her a chapter of a Magic Tree House book until Lily's eyes closed. Then she sat at the booth and she thought about everything Bernard had told her. A stolen shipment from Vietnam. Old men who had waited 50 years. A locked box, probably containing proof of something that would not just pay her debt, but destroy her husband's killers. Her husband had walked into the fire carrying that proof, and the fire had taken him. And the proof had been sitting under her feet for 14 months in a building she did not know existed. She thought about the fact that she was not safe. That Lily was not safe. That at any moment somebody in this town might say something to somebody in the next town, and that information might travel along a chain of phone calls and quiet conversations and end up at the ear of somebody who would send somebody to Hadley's Bend. But she also thought about the other thing that was true. She was not alone. Not anymore. Ruth had built, over 30 years of feeding people, a small army of friends in this town. Bernard had promised to help her. Daniel had left her a map. Daniel had loved her. Daniel had been trying, the whole time, to save her. She thought about her husband as he had been the last time she had seen him. He had left for work that morning in the blue shirt she had ironed for him the night before. He had kissed Lily on the top of her head. He had said to Claire, as he always said, "Love you," back at 6. She had said, "Love you." And he had walked out the door and into a fight that she had not known he was fighting. And he had lost. And in losing, he had left her the tools she needed to finish it. She whispered into the quiet of the dark diner, "I'm going to finish it, Daniel. I promise. For you. For Lily. For your mother. For your father, whatever he did. For all of it. I'm going to finish it." And then she went to sleep on the air mattress next to her daughter, and she slept, for the first time in weeks, without dreaming. At dawn, she woke up to the sound of a knock on the side door. 3 slow knocks. Then silence. Then 3 more. It was Bernard. He had come back. He was holding 2 thermoses of coffee and a small canvas bag. Claire opened the door, and he stepped inside, and he said, "It's time. Wake the little one. We need to be at the graveyard before anybody else is on the roads." She dressed Lily quickly in her warmest clothes and wrapped a scarf around her. Bernard drove them in his old truck. The sky was lightening to a pale pink as they pulled up to the Methodist cemetery. The gate squeaked when Bernard pushed it open. They walked to row 14. Harold Donovan's grave. Plain granite. No flowers. A small American flag stuck into the ground at a slight angle. Bernard said, "Honey, look around the base of the stone." Claire knelt. She ran her fingers around the base of Harold's headstone. At the back, where the stone met the ground, her fingers found a small, loose section of sod. She lifted it. Beneath the sod, pressed into the dirt, was a small flat tin, the kind that once held breath mints. She pulled it out. She opened it. Inside was a small brass key, the kind that would fit a small lockbox. She held it up to Bernard. Bernard nodded once. His face was grim. "Let's go," he said. "Let's open it." They drove back to the diner as the sun came up over the flat fields. Claire carried the key in her pocket. Lily, who had been told they were going on an adventure, sat between them in the truck and chattered about how cold her nose was. Bernard said little. Claire said less. They were both thinking about what might be in the box. At the diner, Bernard checked the parking lot carefully before getting out. He walked the perimeter of the building once. He nodded to Claire. They went inside. Claire lifted the planks behind the counter. She took out the lockbox. She sat on the floor. She put the key in the lock. She turned it. The lock clicked. She lifted the lid. Inside the box, on top, was a slim manila folder. Beneath that, wrapped in a blue velvet cloth, was something small and hard and rectangular. And beneath that, at the very bottom, was a cassette tape, the old-fashioned kind with 2 reels visible through a plastic window, labeled in Daniel's handwriting with one word, insurance. Claire took out the folder first. She opened it. Inside were photocopies of documents. Shipping manifests dated 1974 and 1975, stamped with unit designations she did not understand. A handwritten ledger with dates and amounts and coded names. Photographs, grainy and old, of men in uniform standing beside stacked wooden crates in what looked like a warehouse somewhere hot. A list of names, typed, with addresses beside them, most of the addresses in the United States, a few in other countries. One of the names at the top of the list was Harold Donovan. Another, about halfway down, was a name Claire did not know but that Bernard recognized immediately. "That's the one," Bernard said, pointing at the 3rd name on the list with a finger that was not quite steady. "That's the one who came to Danny's office. That's the one who squeezed him. That's the man who had Ruth killed. His name is Peter Larkin. He was a lieutenant in Harold's unit. He's been the face of the organization in this country for 40 years. Claire stared at the name typed on the yellowed paper. Peter Larkin. A name. A real name. Not a ghost. Not a faceless threat. A man who had ordered her mother-in-law pushed down a flight of stairs, and who had probably arranged whatever had happened in that cheap motel room where Daniel had died. She set the folder aside. She picked up the velvet-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a single gold bar, stamped with markings and characters she could not read, small enough to fit in her palm, but heavy enough that she had to brace her wrist. Bernard looked at it, and he whistled, softly, between his teeth. "That's a sample," he said. "That's proof. Danny found a piece of it. I don't know how, but he found a piece of it. And he kept it. Because physical evidence, together with the documents, together with whatever is on that tape, is what flips a federal case from rumor into prosecution. What's on the tape? I would bet everything I own, Bernard said, that it is a recording of Peter Larkin admitting what he did, or admitting what the organization did, or threatening Danny in a way that nobody could explain away. Danny was smart. He would not have called it insurance for nothing. Claire sat on the floor of the diner with the gold bar in her lap and the documents beside her, and she understood, finally, what her husband had been doing in the last months of his life. He had not just been trying to run. He had been trying to build a case. He had been gathering evidence, piece by piece, against the men who had been bleeding him dry. He had been planning to hand it over and accept whatever consequences came for the money he had stolen, as long as the handover also took the men down and took the debt off his family forever. He had not been a coward. He had been, in his last year, braver than she had ever known him to be. And he had paid for that bravery with his life. Bernard crouched down beside her, and he put a weathered hand on her shoulder. "Honey," he said, "this is not over. This is the beginning of the next part. We have what Danny built. Now we have to get it into the right hands without those hands being compromised. We have to find a federal agent who can't be bought, who can't be turned, who will run this all the way to arrests and convictions before Larkin figures out that his leverage is gone. That is a hard thing to do, but it is not impossible. I know some people, friends of friends, old military men who went into federal service and stayed clean. I will make some calls, quietly, from a phone that is not in my name. In the meantime," Claire said, "what do I do?" "In the meantime," Bernard said, "you run this diner." Claire looked at him. Bernard smiled, a small tired smile. "You run the diner, girl. You open it back up. You hire Dolores. You buy a few supplies with what Danny left you. You serve hamburgers and coffee to farmers and truckers. You become an ordinary woman who inherited a building and made a go of it. Because the best place to hide somebody Peter Larkin is looking for is in plain sight, doing the most boring thing imaginable. He is looking for a widow and hiding. He is not looking for a diner owner in Hadley's Bend who never stopped being here. Your mother-in-law, God rest her, built this place for exactly this purpose, though she did not know it. She built a hiding place out of French fries and meatloaf. You step into that hiding place, and you disappear into it, and while you disappear, I work on the other end." Claire looked around the empty diner, the torn vinyl booths, the chalkboard with Daniel's handwriting, the counter where Ruth had stood for 30 years. She said, "I don't know how to run a diner." Bernard said, "Dolores knows how to run a diner. Marge knows how to run a diner. Half the town used to work here. You don't need to know. You just need to say yes." Claire looked at the gold bar in her lap. She looked at the folder of documents. She looked at the cassette tape. She looked at Lily, who had fallen back asleep in the booth, curled up under Claire's coat with her stuffed rabbit under her chin. She said, "Okay." She said yes. She said, "Let's open the diner." Bernard closed the lockbox gently. He tucked it under his arm. He said, "I'll keep this at my house, in a place Larkin would never think to look. It's safer there than here. You come over any time you want to see it. But it should not sit in this building, where somebody might decide to go looking." She nodded. They stood up together. The morning sun had come fully over the horizon now and was slanting in through the plate glass windows at the front of the diner, lighting up the dust in the air, making the red vinyl of the booths glow. Lily stirred in her sleep and made a small soft sound and settled. Claire looked around at her dead mother-in-law's dead diner, and for the first time she thought, "It isn't dead. It has just been sleeping. And now I am going to wake it up." Outside, somewhere on County Road B, a tractor rumbled past, the first traffic of the day. A farmer going out to check his cattle. The sound of ordinary life in Hadley's Bend resuming itself, just as it had every morning for 100 years. Bernard turned at the side door. He looked back at her. He said, "Your husband would be proud of you, girl." Claire did not trust herself to speak. She nodded. Bernard said, "I'll be back tonight. You lock up tight until then. Anybody comes who you don't know, you don't open that door. You call me. My number is on the card I gave you. You understand?" "I understand." He left. His old truck started up outside and rumbled away down the road. Claire stood alone in the diner in the growing morning light, and she felt, for the first time in 14 months, something she had not expected to feel again. She felt like herself, not the frightened homeless widow, not the ashamed survivor of a broken marriage, not the exhausted mother sleeping in parking lots, but the person she had been before all of it, the person who read books carefully and took notes and finished what she started and kept promises. That person had not died. That person had only been buried under grief and fear and cold. And here, in this cold diner in a town she had never heard of 3 weeks ago, that person had come back up to the surface. She went to Lily. She lifted her daughter gently off the booth seat. Lily made a small sleepy sound and put her arms around Claire's neck. Claire carried her to the back office and laid her down on the air mattress and pulled the blanket over her. Then she went to the kitchen and she looked at the old 8-burner range, caked with grease, and the long counter with its chrome stools, and the walk-in freezer, and the big flat grill. And she thought, I need a list. She found a paper napkin. She found a pen in the office. She sat down at the booth and she began to write. Clean the grill. Scrub the counters. Wash the vinyl. Replace bulbs. Order a new sign. Call the health inspector. Find a food supplier. Hire Dolores. Hire a second waitress. Set a menu. Print menus. Buy aprons. Open a business account at the bank. Learn the basics of payroll. Figure out taxes. Figure out permits. Figure out insurance. Pay property taxes current. Replace the broken front windows. Fix the front sign. The list grew and grew. She filled one side of the napkin, then the other. Then she got another napkin. By the time Lily woke up, Claire had 4 napkins of handwriting and a small but growing sense of direction. She had no idea whether she would succeed. She had no idea whether the diner would ever turn a profit. She had no idea whether Bernard's plan to hide her in plain sight would actually work. She had no idea whether Peter Larkin would ever show up. She only knew that she had $82,000, a building, a daughter, a town that seemed to want her to stay, an 87-year-old ally, and a dead husband whose final act on earth had been to leave her a way forward. That was enough. That was, at this moment, in this cold, quiet diner at the end of a county road, enough. Lily came out of the office rubbing her eyes. She saw Claire at the booth writing on napkins. She climbed up onto the bench seat beside her mother. She looked at the long list. Mama, she said, what are you doing? Claire set down the pen. She put her arm around her daughter. She kissed the top of her head. Baby, she said, I'm making a plan. A plan for what? A plan to open Grandma's diner. You and me. We're going to run Grandma's diner. What do you think? Lily considered this very seriously. Then she said, can I help? You can help. Can I wear an apron? You can wear an apron. Can it be yellow? Claire went still for a moment. Yellow. The color of her first balloon. The last clue. The last number. She looked down at her daughter's hopeful face, and she thought about Daniel bringing home a yellow balloon on the 13th of every month for 2 years, and she thought about how the color yellow had been chosen as the last number because it was the color of Lily, the color of the child they had made together, the color of the thing he was protecting. She said, Baby, your apron is going to be yellow. The prettiest yellow you ever saw. Lily nodded, satisfied. She said, okay, I'm going to go get my rabbit. She needs a yellow apron too. She hopped off the booth and padded back to the office. Claire watched her go. Then Claire picked up her pen, and at the bottom of the 3rd napkin, beneath all the other items on her list, she wrote in careful letters, Order 2 yellow aprons. Adult size and child size. She sat in the booth in the morning sun and she thought, all right, Daniel. All right, here we go. Outside, on County Road B, another tractor went past. Somewhere far away, an interstate truck downshifted. The diner creaked softly in the cold. The heater hissed. The world continued. And somewhere, in a city hundreds of miles away, a man named Peter Larkin was no doubt beginning to wonder, in his own quiet, patient way, what had happened to the widow of Daniel Donovan, where she had gone to ground, and how long it would take before she surfaced again. He did not know, but he would look, and when he looked, he would find his way, eventually, to a cold diner at the crossroads of 2 county highways in a town he had never heard of. And on that day, Claire would need to be ready, and Bernard would need to be ready, and the town of Hadley's Bend, without quite knowing it, would need to be ready too. For now, she picked up her pen. For now, she kept writing her list. For now, her daughter came back with her stuffed rabbit, and Claire lifted the rabbit and pretended to tie a yellow apron around its tiny waist, and Lily laughed, a real laugh, the first real laugh in weeks, and the sound filled the empty diner like light filling a long dark room. The diner was waking up. So was Claire. The diner reopened on a Thursday in March, 6 weeks after Claire had bought it for $7. The morning was clear and cold, and the sun came up over the fields a little after 7. And by 7:30, there were 14 cars in the parking lot, and a line of people standing outside the front door in heavy coats with their breath clouding in the air. Claire stood behind the counter in a new yellow apron and looked out through the plate glass windows, which had been replaced the week before by a young man from Ellsworth who had refused to charge her full price because his grandmother had worked for Ruth in the 80s. Beside her, Dolores was already running coffee from the big pot Claire had bought secondhand from a church that was closing down, and across the room, Lily sat in booth number 8, the same booth where Daniel and Thomas had once eaten French fries on a rainy afternoon, wearing a smaller yellow apron and coloring in a paper placemat with a box of crayons that Marge had pressed into her hands that morning. Claire had not slept much the night before. She had lain awake on the mattress in the small upstairs apartment, listening to the building, thinking about all the ways the opening could go wrong. The grill could fail. The gas could cut out. Nobody could come. Too many people could come. Health inspector could surprise them. Water pipe could burst. But when Dolores had arrived at 5 in the morning to start the biscuits, she had told Claire to go upstairs and lie down until the first customer, because, Dolores said, if you are going to be running this place for the next 20 years, you are going to have to learn that you cannot do every shift personally, and today is a good day to learn. Claire had gone upstairs and lain down on the mattress and not slept and stared at the ceiling and felt something in her chest that was close to hope and close to fear at the same time, which, she had decided, was probably what starting over was supposed to feel like. Now, at 7:30 in the morning, watching the line outside grow, she went to the front door and unlocked it, and she said, in a voice that came out steadier than she expected, "Good morning, everybody. Come on in. We're open." The first person through the door was Leland, because Leland had driven into the lot at 7:20 specifically to be first. He took off his cap as he came inside, and he looked around at the diner. The new vinyl on the booths, red like the old, but not cracked. The clean grill. The chalkboard behind the counter, which Claire had scrubbed down and rewritten in her own handwriting, but which also still had, preserved under a thin layer of clear lacquer at the very bottom, Daniel's old line about meatloaf for $7.95, because Claire had not been able to bring herself to erase it. The smell of bacon and coffee and fresh biscuits. The sound of the old radio behind the counter playing a classic country station. Leland looked around for a long moment, and then he looked at Claire, and his eyes were wet, and he said, "Ruth would cry, honey. Ruth would cry." He sat down at the counter. He ordered the number 2 breakfast, which was eggs, sausage, and hash browns, the same breakfast he had ordered at this counter for the first 37 years of his adult life. Dolores brought it to him on a white plate. Leland cut into the eggs, and he ate slowly, with the care of a man who knew that what he was eating was more than food. By 8 o'clock, every booth was full, and every stool at the counter was occupied, and there were 3 people waiting. By 9, Claire had run out of bacon. By 10, she had run out of biscuits, and Dolores had started making pancakes from a backup batter. By noon, a small news photographer from the county weekly paper had driven out from Ellsworth with a camera around his neck, saying he'd heard about the reopening. And he took pictures of Claire and Lily behind the counter, and of the crowded booths, and of Dolores laughing with a customer. And a week later the paper ran a front-page photograph with a caption that read, "The Roadside Lives Again," and underneath, in smaller print, "Ruth Donovan's granddaughter-in-law has reopened the beloved Hadley's Bend Diner after nearly 2 decades closed." Claire saw that caption and she corrected it in her own mind because Ruth's son's wife and Ruth's granddaughter-in-law were technically different things, but she decided she did not mind. In Hadley's Bend, they had decided she was family. She was not going to correct them. The first week was chaos. Claire was on her feet from 5 in the morning until 9 at night. She cooked, ran the register, bussed tables, took orders, washed dishes when the dishwasher backed up, consoled Lily when Lily got overwhelmed, hired 2 more waitresses, fired one of them on the 3rd day for pocketing tips, and hired a replacement that afternoon. By the end of the first week, she had lost 4 pounds she could not afford to lose, and her feet hurt in a way she did not know feet could hurt, and her back ached when she lay down at night. And she had also learned, by necessity, how to take a food order in shorthand, how to make 4 different kinds of eggs at the same time on the same grill, how to judge from the slight shift in a customer's posture whether he wanted a refill of coffee, how to tell a drunk man politely but firmly that he had to leave, how to balance a tray on her forearm, how to fix a coffee pot that had stopped brewing without calling a repairman, and how to take a breath between the breakfast rush and the lunch rush instead of crying, which is what she had wanted to do the first 3 days. By the end of the second week, she had also learned that Dolores had been, for a quiet decade between Ruth's diner and her current part-time job at the nursing home, a shift manager at a truck stop on the interstate, and that Dolores knew everything there was to know about inventory, food safety, and how to deal with the occasional drunk customer who wandered in at closing. Claire raised Dolores's pay twice in those first 2 weeks without Dolores asking, and Dolores cried the second time and said nobody had ever given her a raise she did not ask for. And Claire hugged her at the register and said, "Dolores, you are the reason this place is standing, and I am not ever going to let you forget it." Bernard came for breakfast every morning. He sat at the counter on the same stool Leland had taken the first day, and he drank black coffee, and he read the county weekly, and he watched. Not obviously. He did not stare at the door or start at sudden sounds. He simply paid attention to who came in, who sat where, who lingered, who left too quickly. Every morning before he left, he paid his check, and he nodded at Claire, and he said, "See you tomorrow, Claire." And Claire would nod back. And every night after closing, when Lily was asleep upstairs, Bernard would come back and knock on the side door, and Claire would let him in, and he would sit at booth number 8 and tell her what he had noticed and what he had not, and whether anybody in particular had made him uneasy. Most nights there was nothing to report. But the watching continued anyway, because Bernard had said, "A watchful eye that sees nothing for 51 weeks is still the eye that saves you in the 52nd. Bernard had also been making his calls, not from his own phone, from a borrowed landline at the house of an old friend in a neighboring county, a man named Walter who had served with him in Korea and who asked no questions and offered no opinions. Bernard had reached, through 2 intermediaries, a man named Carlos Rivera who was a special agent with the FBI field office in Kansas City, a decorated investigator in his 50s who had come up through organized crime casework and had a reputation among a certain small circle of old veterans as one of the clean ones. Rivera had listened to Bernard's story over the course of 3 separate phone calls spread across a month because Bernard had given him the information in careful pieces, never enough at one time to identify Claire, never enough to give Rivera a target location. The final call, which took place in the middle of the 4th week after Claire had reopened the diner, had ended with Rivera saying, "Mr. Grady, I believe you. I am going to need to see what you have. I am going to need to meet the woman. I am going to need to hear that tape. If what you have describes what I think it describes, then I can build something. But I need to come to you, quietly, and I need to do it in a way that Peter Larkin's people will not notice, because they have ears in more places than you probably want to know about." Bernard had said, "Agent, you come alone. You come in a car that is not a government car. You come on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays are quiet. You come after dark. You park at the old feed store on Route 19, which has been closed for 9 years, and you walk from there. I will meet you at the edge of the tree line behind the diner. You bring nothing with you except a small recording device and a notebook. And you tell nobody, not your partner, not your supervisor, not your wife, until you have what we have and you understand why it matters." Rivera had said, "Mr. Grady, I have been doing this for a long time. I know how to come quietly. Next Tuesday, 9 p.m. Tell the lady to expect company." That had been 2 days ago. Tonight was Sunday. Tomorrow was Monday. Tuesday was the day. Claire closed the diner at 8 that Sunday night with Dolores, and they counted out the register together, and Dolores went home, and Claire walked Lily upstairs and ran her a bath and read her 2 chapters of a Magic Treehouse book and kissed her forehead and said, "Good night, baby." Lily said, "Mama, are we still going to live here forever?" Claire said, "As long as you want a baby." Lily said, "I want to. I like it here. My rabbit likes it here too." Claire said, "Good. Then we're staying." Lily said, "With Bernard and Dolores and Marge?" Claire said, "Yes. With Bernard and Dolores and Marge." And Lily had smiled and rolled over and closed her eyes and been asleep within a minute, in the way that only 7-year-olds can fall asleep. And Claire had sat on the edge of the bed for a long time watching her daughter breathe and thinking about Tuesday. On Monday, the diner was slow. Mondays always were. Claire used the time to go over the books with Dolores and to order supplies and to scrub the walk-in freezer, which did not need scrubbing, but which Claire needed to do because she needed to work with her hands to keep her mind from spinning. Bernard came in at 11 and drank a cup of coffee and said, quietly, "Everything ready?" Claire nodded. Bernard said, "I'll come over at 8 tomorrow evening." We will wait at booth 8. Rivera should be through the tree line by 9. I will walk out and meet him and bring him in through the side door. You sit with Lily upstairs until I call you. Do not let Lily come downstairs no matter what she hears. Do you understand? Claire said, I understand. Bernard patted her hand once, the way a father would, and he left. Tuesday was the longest day of Claire's life. The diner opened at 6 and closed at 8. Customers came and went. Claire smiled at them and poured coffee and took orders, and her hands did not shake. But somewhere inside her chest something was wound so tightly she could feel it pulling against her ribs. At 7:30, Dolores, who had been watching her all day, said, Honey, go upstairs. I'll close. Go. Claire did not argue. She went upstairs and she made Lily grilled cheese, and Lily asked why Mama was not eating, and Claire said Mama had eaten at the diner, which was a lie. Lily accepted it. They ate together and Claire read her a book, and at 7:45 Lily was asleep, because Mondays had worn her out and Tuesdays always did too. At 7:58, Claire heard the side door open downstairs. Bernard's boots on the kitchen floor. A moment later, another set of boots, lighter, quieter. 2 men. She waited at the top of the stairs and listened, and she heard Bernard's voice say, Come on through. She's expecting us. And a second voice, deeper, polite, said, Thank you, Mr. Grady. Then Bernard called up the stairs, softly, Claire, come down when you're ready. She came down. Carlos Rivera was a compact man in his mid-50s, black hair going gray at the temples, a dark wool coat that had seen some years, a pair of reading glasses folded into his shirt pocket. He was standing in the middle of the empty diner with his hands folded in front of him, turning slowly to take in the room. When Claire came down the hall, he turned toward her and he smiled, a small, kind, tired smile, and he said, Mrs. Donovan, I am very sorry for your loss. I am glad to meet you. Claire had braced herself for this meeting in a dozen ways. She had expected to be frightened. She had expected to be professional. She had expected to be suspicious. What she had not expected was to feel, suddenly, a huge wave of relief. Because for the first time since Daniel's disappearance, somebody in authority had spoken to her as if her husband had been a person, not a case file. She shook his hand, and she said, Agent Rivera, thank you for coming. Please sit down. I made coffee. They sat at booth number 8. Bernard poured 3 cups from the carafe Claire had left on the table. Claire brought out the lockbox from the kitchen, where she had moved it that afternoon, and set it on the table. Rivera did not open it immediately. He looked at her first. He said, Mrs. Donovan, before we go through what is in this box, I want to tell you what I already know, so that you can correct me if I am wrong, and so that you understand I am not starting from zero. She nodded. Rivera said, The organization you are dealing with has been on my desk, at one level or another, for 11 years. We know it exists. We know roughly who is in it. We have never been able to prosecute any of them because they are meticulous, and because every witness we have ever approached has either gotten frightened and recanted, or has died in what on paper looks like an accident. Peter Larkin himself I have had eyes on twice in 6 years. I have never been able to put him in a room with anything we could prove. The case against him has always been 3 steps short of what a U.S. attorney will take. If what is in this box gives me those 3 steps, I can arrest him within a week of bringing it back to Kansas City. If it does not, I can still probably protect you and your daughter, but I cannot end the threat, and I will not lie to you about that. Claire said, I understand. Rivera said, May I? She slid the box across the table. He opened it. He took out the folder first, and he read through the documents with an expression that went from careful neutrality to careful intensity. He did not speak for 5 minutes. He turned pages. He looked at the photograph of the crates in the warehouse for a long time. He looked at the list of names. When he reached Peter Larkin's name, he put his finger on it, and he said, There you are, you son of a bitch, very quietly, almost to himself. He set the folder down. He took out the velvet bundle. He unwrapped the gold bar. He weighed it in his hand. He looked at the markings. He said, This is from the shipment. I can prove where it came from. We have documentation of the melt patterns from the original mint. This matches. This is actual physical evidence of the theft, which I have been hoping to see for 11 years. If your husband had found only this, it would have been enough to open a formal case. He set it down. He picked up the cassette tape. He looked at the label. He looked at Claire. Do you have a tape player? Claire said yes. She went behind the counter and she came back with the old tabletop radio from which she had retrieved the third number clue. It had a cassette deck built into the side. She had not yet listened to the tape. She had not been able to. She had not wanted to hear her husband's voice, or Peter Larkin's voice, or whatever else might be on that tape, until she had somebody with her who would know what to do with it. Rivera put the tape in. He pressed play. There was a hiss of empty tape. Then a voice, distant and a little distorted, but unmistakable. Daniel's voice. Claire's hand went to her mouth. Daniel said, "This is a conversation recorded by Daniel Michael Donovan, engineer, residing in." He gave the address of the house she had lost. The date on this recording is. He gave a date that Claire recognized as 3 weeks before he had disappeared. Present in the room are myself and Peter Larkin. The following is taking place at my office. Mr. Larkin, I understand you have made another demand for payment. Then, on the tape, a second voice. Older, smoother. A voice that made the hair on the back of Claire's neck stand up even though she had never heard it before. Daniel, we've had this conversation. You know how this works. Your father did a thing a long time ago. The thing had a cost. The cost has to be paid. Your father is dead. Your mother was not able to help. That leaves you. And eventually, if you continue to be difficult, it leaves your wife, and after your wife, your daughter. This is not a threat, Daniel. This is just the arithmetic of the situation. Daniel's voice. You had my mother killed. Larkin, I did not. Your mother fell down a set of stairs because she was 76 years old, and because the stairs in that apartment were too steep for a woman her age. I regret her death. I had nothing to do with it. Daniel, we both know that isn't true. Larkin, Daniel, what we both know and what can be proven are two different things. I would think an engineer would understand the difference. Daniel, how much more do you want? Larkin, the number is $280,000. I want it in 90 days. I want it in the usual account. After that payment, we will reassess. Daniel, reassess meaning you will demand more. Larkin, reassess meaning we will see where things stand. It is not helpful to predict the future, Daniel. Pay what is owed now, and the future will take care of itself. Daniel, what if I go to the FBI? Larkin was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, in a voice that was almost gentle, Daniel, if you go to the FBI, I will personally see to it that your wife is dead within 48 hours of the first agent knocking on your door. I have a man who specializes in this. He will make it look like a car accident. It will look so much like a car accident that the police will close the investigation within a week. And then, Daniel, I will come to you in whatever protective custody they have placed you in, because protective custody has never kept anybody safe from us. And I will make sure that your daughter grows up wondering what really happened to both of her parents. Do you understand what I am telling you? Daniel's voice, very quiet. Yes. Larkin, then stop wasting my time. Pay what you owe. 90 days. There was a pause, and then the sound of a chair scraping, and then the tape went quiet, and a few seconds later Daniel's voice came back on, alone, saying, recording ended. Let the record show that the foregoing was an accurate account of the conversation I had with Peter Larkin on this date, at this location. This recording is being preserved as evidence. If I am killed before this recording can be given to the proper authorities, it is my wish that my wife Claire find it and use it. The tape clicked. Claire sat in the booth with her face wet and her hands trembling. She had not realized she had started crying. She put her hand over her mouth to keep from making sound, because Lily was asleep upstairs. Rivera let the silence sit for a long moment before he spoke. He said, Mrs. Donovan, that is a confession, in plain English, to extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and threats against a witness. Combined with the documents and the physical evidence, I have enough to arrest Peter Larkin and charge him with federal crimes that carry life sentences. I have enough to roll up most of his organization. I have enough, frankly, that I am going to have a long conversation with my supervisor about why the FBI did not find this tape sitting in an engineer's filing cabinet 14 months ago, because somebody should have searched that cabinet, and somebody did not, and I want to know why. Claire said, in a voice that was not quite steady, what happens now? Rivera said, now I take this evidence back to Kansas City. I will make sure it is copied and stored in 3 different places before I do anything else. I will walk it into my supervisor's office on Thursday morning. By Friday, we will have a warrant for Larkin's arrest. By Saturday morning, a team of agents will pick him up at his home in St. Louis. We will do it in a way that does not give him time to make phone calls or send signals. From that moment forward, Mrs. Donovan, you are safe from him personally. He will spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Claire said, and the organization. Rivera said, the organization will take longer. But Peter Larkin has been the face of it in this country for 40 years. With him gone, and with the evidence you have given me, I can name 5 other senior people in this country and probably a dozen below them. We will work our way through. It will not happen overnight, but it will happen. And from what I have seen on that tape, Mrs. Donovan, once Larkin is in custody, the remaining members of the organization will not be looking for you. They will be too busy trying to stay out of custody themselves. They will consider the debt closed, not out of mercy, but because the man who remembered your family's name will be in a cell and nobody else will be inclined to pick up where he left off. He stopped. He folded his hands on the table. He said, I know that none of this brings your husband back. I am not going to pretend that it does. But I want you to know that Daniel Donovan did something that most people could not do. He documented the men who were extorting him in a way that nobody else ever has. He died before he could deliver the evidence himself, but he made sure you could deliver it for him. He chose you as the person who would finish his work. He could not have made a better choice. Claire cried quietly for a while. Bernard sat beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Rivera waited, patient, not uncomfortable with tears, the way only people who have spent long careers listening to the worst moments of other people's lives can learn to wait. When she had composed herself, she said, Agent Rivera, what do I do while you do this? Rivera said, you continue to run your diner. You do not discuss any of this with anybody. You do not make any sudden changes. You live exactly the life you were living yesterday. Between now and Saturday morning, I am going to station 2 deputies from the county sheriff's office in an unmarked car at the end of your road. They will not be visible to you. They will be visible to anybody approaching the property who knows what to look for. The sheriff himself is an old friend of Mr. Grady's, and he has agreed to handle this personally. On Saturday morning, after Larkin is in custody, I will call you. At that point, you can return to a normal life. I expect a normal life for you, Mrs. Donovan. Will involve this diner and this town and your daughter and the freedom to know that nobody is coming for any of you. Is that acceptable? Claire laughed, a small broken laugh that was also a kind of sob. Yes, Agent. That is acceptable. Rivera smiled. He stood up. He gathered the evidence into his small, worn leather satchel. He tucked the satchel under his arm. He shook Bernard's hand, and then Claire's, and he said, Good night, Mrs. Donovan. Good night, Mr. Grady. I will be in touch. Lock the door behind me. He left through the side entrance. They heard his footsteps in the gravel, and then nothing. Bernard walked to the kitchen window and watched until he saw the brief flash of headlights far down the road that meant Rivera had reached his car at the old feed store. Bernard turned back to Claire. He said, Well, girl, you did it. Claire said, Daniel did it. I just delivered it. Bernard said, Honey, delivery is 9/10 of the work. Your husband put the evidence in a box. You opened the box. You got it into the right hands. 1,000 people could have opened that box and not known what to do with it. You knew what to do with it. Take the credit. Your husband would want you to. Claire went upstairs and checked on Lily. Lily was asleep with her rabbit under her chin, breathing softly. Claire kissed her forehead and stood in the doorway for a long moment watching her daughter sleep. And she thought, You're going to grow up knowing who your father was. Not the version the police told me. Not the version the accountants told me. The real version. The version who loved you enough to die trying to keep you safe. I am going to tell you about him. Not tonight, but when you are old enough. I am going to tell you everything. The next 4 days moved slowly. Claire ran the diner. Bernard drank his coffee. Dolores made biscuits. Customers came and went. 2 men in an unmarked sedan parked at the end of the road at the intersection with Route 19 switched out every 12 hours with a different pair of men in a different unmarked sedan. Claire did not acknowledge them. They did not acknowledge her. The arrangement felt strange and also comforting, like a set of locks she did not have to check, because somebody else was checking them for her. On Saturday morning at 7:15, her cell phone rang in the pocket of her apron while she was pouring coffee for a trucker named Ray. She excused herself and stepped into the little office behind the kitchen, and she answered. Mrs. Donovan, Rivera said, We have him. Peter Larkin was taken into custody at 5:40 this morning at his home in St. Louis. He did not resist. He has asked for an attorney. He has not made any phone calls. We are now picking up 4 additional individuals based on the evidence you provided. There are no more surveillance cars at the end of your road. You are, as of this moment, officially no longer under any active threat. Your husband's case will be formally reopened and the record will be corrected to reflect what actually happened to him. That process will take months, but I will personally see it through. I wanted to tell you myself, first, before I tell anybody else in my office how this case came together. I wanted you to know today that it is done. Claire said, "Thank you, Agent." Rivera said, "Thank you, Mrs. Donovan." And thank Mr. Grady. And when your daughter is old enough to understand what her father did, you tell her from me that her father was a brave man. I will, Claire said. She hung up. She stood in the small office with her hand on the desk, and she took a long, slow breath. Then she went back out to the counter, and she finished pouring Ray's coffee. And Ray said, "Everything all right, ma'am?" And Claire said, "Yes, Ray. Everything is all right." And she meant it, in a way that she had not meant it in over a year. That night, Claire closed the diner early. She hung a hand-lettered sign on the door that said closed for a family dinner, back tomorrow at 6 a.m., and she cooked. She cooked the biggest meal she had ever cooked in her life. She roasted a chicken the way Margaret Shen had taught her, and she made mashed potatoes and green beans and cornbread, and she set the long front booth with plates and cloth napkins she had bought at the Salvation Army in Ellsworth, and she invited everybody. Bernard came. Dolores and her husband came. Marge and Caleb came. Leland came with his wife Helen, who Claire had not yet met, but who came bearing a blueberry pie. Vic the plumber and Patricia the librarian came. 9 people around a diner booth that was supposed to seat 6, crammed together shoulder to shoulder, laughing, passing plates, spilling gravy. Claire stood at the head of the table with a mason jar of sweet tea in her hand. Before anybody started eating, she tapped the jar gently with a fork. Everybody quieted. She said, "I have something to say. I am not going to say most of it tonight, because most of it is going to take years to say, but I want to say this. 6 weeks ago, I drove into this town with $7 and a daughter and nowhere to go. In 6 weeks, every single one of you has given me something I could not have bought with a fortune. You gave me a roof that does not leak. You gave me a daughter who is laughing again. You gave me a business that is keeping us fed. You gave me friends. You gave me a place where people say my name when I walk in. My husband grew up in this town and never told me about it. I have been angry at him for a lot of reasons in the last 14 months, but I am not angry at him tonight. Because tonight I understand that he was trying, the only way he knew how, to send me home. And you are home. All of you. You are my home." She stopped, because her voice was breaking. She said, to Ruth, who I never met, "Thank you for feeding people for 30 years. Thank you for being the reason all of these people showed up to help me. You built this place, and it outlasted you, and I am going to try to be worthy of it for as long as I can. I never knew you, but I feel like I know you now. Every time I open the grill in the morning, I think about you doing the same thing every morning for 30 years before me. Every time I take a plate out to Leland, I think about you doing it 20 years ago. Every time Lily laughs at a booth, I think about the little girl I never got to be for you, and the granddaughter you never got to hold. I am sorry about all of that. I am sorry the people who did this to your family stole so many years. But I promise you, Ruth, that those years are over now. The name on the sign out front is yours, and it is going to stay yours. And when I am too old to cook and somebody else is running this place, it will still be yours, because this building is your building, and nobody is ever going to forget that." She raised the jar. To Ruth. They all raised their glasses. To Ruth, they said. And to Harold, she said, who did a wrong thing once, and paid for it for the rest of his life, and whose grandchildren will grow up free of that debt. I did not know Harold either, but I know this. A man who comes home from a war carrying something broken inside him, and who still manages to raise a son who grew up to be the man I married, cannot have been only his worst moments. He was more than what he did in 1975. He was a mechanic who fixed the cars of his neighbors. He was a man who loved Ruth for 40 years. He was the grandfather my daughter will never get to meet, and I am going to make sure she knows that he existed, and that he tried, and that he failed at some things but succeeded at others. To Harold, may he rest easier now, wherever he is. To Harold, they said. And to Daniel, she said, and her voice did break now, but she did not stop. To Daniel, who was braver than I knew, who loved me, who carried a burden alone for 3 years because he thought he had to, and who tried, in the end, to put that burden down in a way that would not crush the people he loved. I have been angry at him. I have been so angry at him I could not breathe, some nights. But tonight, in this room, I understand what he did and why he did it, and I forgive him. I forgive him every day he did not tell me. I forgive him every secret he kept. I forgive him for leaving. Because the leaving was not leaving. The leaving was the only way he could find to stay. And he stayed. He stayed long enough to leave me a map. He stayed long enough to leave me a key. He stayed long enough to leave me all of you. He did not get to come home himself, but he sent me home in his place. To Daniel. To Daniel, they said. Lily, who had been sitting on Bernard's knee because there were more people than seats, raised her plastic cup of apple juice. To Daddy, she said. To Daddy, they all said. And Claire sat down at the head of the table in her dead mother-in-law's diner, and she looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family, and she began, finally, to eat. 6 months later, the diner had settled into a rhythm. Breakfast shift from 6 to 10:30. Lunch from 11 to 2. Dinner 4 nights a week, Wednesday through Saturday. Dolores ran the front. Claire ran the kitchen. A young woman named Reese from Ellsworth had come on as a second cook and had turned out to have a talent for pies that made Dolores say, "Honey, this one is a keeper." Claire had renovated the upstairs apartment, and she and Lily lived in it now, with fresh paint and new curtains and a small bedroom for Lily with stars on the ceiling. Lily was enrolled in the Hadley's Bend Elementary School in the 2nd grade, and she had 3 best friends who rotated through sleepovers on weekends. Bernard came for breakfast every morning. He was the unofficial grandfather of the place now. Lily called him Bern, and he let her. Peter Larkin had been formally charged with 6 federal crimes, including the murder for hire of Ruth Donovan and the conspiracy to murder Daniel Donovan, because the reinvestigation of Daniel's death had turned up 2 witnesses and a surveillance photograph that had established Larkin's man had been at the motel the night Daniel died. Larkin was awaiting trial in a federal detention facility. 4 of his associates were also in custody. 2 others had fled the country and were being tracked. Agent Rivera had called Claire once a month, each time with an update. He had come to the diner twice as a customer and had sat at the counter with a slice of Reese's pecan pie and had looked, both times, like a man who was genuinely enjoying his life. The documents and the tape were entered into evidence. The gold bar was held by the Department of Justice as physical proof. Daniel's name, in the file that had been closed as a suicide cover-up, had been officially cleared. A small paragraph in the back section of a national newspaper had reported that a federal case had been reopened in connection with a 1970s Vietnam-era trafficking operation, and that the widow of one of the key witnesses, who had been instrumental in providing the evidence, had asked not to be identified. Claire had read the paragraph at the counter of the diner one morning over coffee, and she had felt nothing but peace. The life insurance company had reversed its decision. $80,000 had been deposited into her account. Claire had used $30,000 of it to put a new roof on the diner. She had put $20,000 into a college fund for Lily. She had put the rest into a savings account that she told herself she would not touch unless she had to. For the first time in her adult life, she had a savings account that had money in it that she was not afraid of losing. On the first anniversary of the day she had bought the diner, on a cold Thursday in February, Claire walked out to the front of the building before dawn and stood in the parking lot looking at the sign. The new sign. The old one had been rusted beyond repair. The new one read, in red letters lit from behind by a soft white glow, Ruth's, and underneath in smaller letters, breakfast all day, coffee hot, welcome home. It had cost $900. It was the best $900 she had ever spent. She stood in the parking lot and she looked up at the sign, and she looked across the road at the tree line where the first morning Bernard had stood watching, and she looked at the plate glass windows she had had replaced, and the new paint on the front wall, and the new gravel in the parking lot, and the planters along the front that Marge had helped her fill last fall, and which would be full of flowers again by May. She said, out loud, to nobody, to everybody, I kept my promise, Daniel. I kept every promise. And she walked inside to start the coffee, because Ray the trucker would be through the door at 6:15, and Leland would be through the door at 6:30, and Bernard would be through the door at 7. And a place that had been called a dead diner at the dead end of a dead road had become, against every reasonable expectation, the living heart of a small town that had been waiting nearly 2 decades for its kitchen to be lit again. 3 years later, on a warm Saturday afternoon in August, Claire stood behind the counter at Ruth's diner and watched as a small ceremony took place outside in the parking lot. The Hadley's Bend Historical Society, which was mostly Marge and 4 of her friends, had decided to put a small bronze plaque on the outside wall of the diner. Claire had tried to talk them out of it. Marge had refused to be talked out of anything. The plaque read, Ruth's Diner. EST 1977. Closed 2007. Reopened 2024. A place that feeds its neighbors. About 40 people had gathered for the unveiling. The mayor of Ellsworth had driven out to say a few words. Lily, who was now 10, wore a Sunday dress and held a pair of scissors that she was too excited about. Agent Carlos Rivera had retired from the FBI and had driven down from Kansas City with his wife to attend. Bernard, 90 now but still sharp and still upright, sat in a folding chair in the front row with a small straw hat on his head. Dolores, who owned a 40% share of the diner now because Claire had insisted on it, stood beside Claire behind the counter, wearing her yellow apron, looking out through the window. The mayor finished his short speech. He invited Claire to say a few words. Claire had been dreading this part all week. She walked out front. Lily took her hand. Claire looked out at the faces in the parking lot, at the people who had become her family. She said, "This building is older than me. It is going to outlast me. A lot of people have cooked in this kitchen, and a lot of people have eaten in these booths. I am one name in a long line of names. I am not the most important one. The most important one was Ruth. Ruth is the reason the rest of us know each other. Ruth is the reason this town had something to come back to. I just had the good fortune to show up at a moment when the lights could be turned back on. I want to thank everybody who handed me the switch. I want to thank everybody who taught me how to cook the gravy. I want to thank everybody who let me make mistakes and loved me anyway. My daughter and I came here 3 years ago with nothing. We have a home now. You are that home. Thank you." She could not say any more. Lily handed her the scissors. Together they cut the red ribbon that had been stretched across the plaque. There was applause. Somebody produced a plate of cookies. Somebody else started a grill in the parking lot, and hamburgers began to cook. The diner, officially closed for the ceremony, filled up anyway, because it was easier for people to spread out inside than to stand in the parking lot, and because nobody in this town had ever been able to stay out of this building once they were in the mood for it. Claire went back inside. She stood behind the counter. Lily came and hugged her around the waist. Not yet too old to do that, though Claire suspected she only had another year or two before Lily became a teenager and got too cool for it. Claire kissed the top of her daughter's head. Bernard walked up to the counter slowly, with a cane now that he didn't always use, but carried anyway. He eased himself onto his stool. He said, "I'll take a coffee, young lady." Claire poured him one. Bernard said, "Danny would be proud, Claire." Claire said, "I know, Bernard." Bernard said, "He knew what he was doing when he sent you here. He did not know how it was going to turn out, but he knew you would figure it out. He trusted you that much." Claire said, "I hope so." Bernard said, "I know so." He took a sip of his coffee. He closed his eyes for a moment in appreciation. He opened them. He said, "Best coffee in 3 counties." Claire laughed. Outside in the parking lot, children were playing. Leland and Helen were sitting on lawn chairs somebody had pulled out from the storeroom. Marge was holding court with a group of women from her church. A dog nobody could identify was wandering from person to person looking for dropped hamburger. The sun was slanting through the trees across the road. It was late afternoon in Hadley's Bend, and a building that had once been called a dead diner on a dead road in a dying town was full of people and full of light and full of the smell of coffee and bacon and hamburger grease. Claire stood behind the counter, and she looked around the diner, and she thought about the woman who had driven up here 3 years ago with $7 in her pocket and a daughter in the back seat, and no plan at all. That woman had not known what she was walking into. That woman had not known her husband had been trying to save her. That woman had not known that the people of this town had been waiting for her. That woman had not known that an 87-year-old man would be watching from the tree line the first morning. That woman had not known that a dead man's letter hidden inside a wall could change the shape of her life. That woman had known only that she had nowhere else to go. Sometimes, Claire thought, the place you go when you have nowhere else to go is the place you were supposed to be all along. Sometimes the last door is the first door. Sometimes the thing people tell you is worthless turns out to be the thing that saves you. Sometimes $7 is exactly enough. Lily tugged at her apron. Lily said, "Mama, can I have a hamburger?" Claire said, "Yes, baby. You can have a hamburger." She turned to the grill. She cracked an egg beside the patty for Dolores, who always wanted an egg on hers. She flipped a row of sizzling meat. The smell came up and filled the kitchen. Through the pass-through she could see her customers, her neighbors, her town. Through the kitchen window she could see, at the far end of the parking lot, a yellow balloon that Lily had tied to the post of the diner sign at breakfast, bobbing gently in the August breeze. Yellow. The color of her first balloon. The last number. The last clue. Daniel's last message. Claire flipped another burger. She was home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.